Hi everyone, welcome to Red Umbrella. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Family Guy didn't just decline in quality over the years, it systematically destroyed everything that made it beloved in the first place. From Seth MacFarlane abandoning the writer's room in 2010, to Peter Griffin transforming from lovable dad into genuine monster, to the show literally killing off Brian for ratings, only to bring him back 3 weeks later, modern Family Guy represents one of the most complete creative collapses in television history. What we're going to explore isn't just a show getting less funny, it's a show that lost its heart, betrayed its characters, and chose lazy shock value over the storytelling and creativity that made it a cultural phenomenon in 1999. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. The 2005 revival changed everything. Family Guy didn't always feel like the show it is today. When it first came out in January 1999, right after the Super Bowl, it was something different. The show followed the Griffin family in the made-up town of Quahog, Rhode Island. There was Peter, the overweight father who worked at a toy factory, Lois, his wife who came from a rich family, their 3 kids, Meg, the unpopular teenage daughter, Chris, the awkward son, and Stewie, the evil baby genius who wanted to kill his mother and take over the world. And of course, Brian, the talking dog who drank martinis and acted as the voice of reason when everyone else was being crazy. In those early years, the show had a very specific feeling to it. Yes, Peter was dumb and made mistakes, but he genuinely loved his family. When he messed up, he'd realise it by the end of the episode and try to make things right. Meg wasn't the punching bag she is now. Peter actually defended her and said he'd take a bullet for her in one episode. Stewie was actually evil, not just gay jokes wrapped in a British accent. Brian was smart and thoughtful, offering good advice even when nobody wanted to hear it. The cutaway gags were there, sure, but they felt fresh and unexpected rather than lazy and predictable. But the show struggled with ratings. After the first season did okay at number 33 in the rankings with about 12.8 million people watching, Fox moved it to a different time slot on Thursday nights at 9 p.m. That was a terrible decision. Family Guy was now competing directly with Frasier on NBC, one of the most popular shows on television at the time. The audience numbers dropped hard. The show fell all the way down to number 114 in the ratings. Fox started airing episodes whenever they felt like it, with no regular schedule. If you wanted to watch Family Guy, you never knew when it would actually be on. Then in May 2000, Fox cancelled the show, but here's where things get interesting. Fox brought it back for a 3rd season after fans complained. The network gave Family Guy one more chance, with 22 episodes for season 3. The show aired from 2001 to 2002, and then Fox cancelled it again. This time, it looked like Family Guy was done for good. The final episode that aired during the original run was called Family Guy Viewer Mail Number 1, which came out in 2002. That was it. Family Guy was dead. Except it wasn't. Something unusual started happening. Even though new episodes weren't being made, people were discovering Family Guy in a completely different way. In 2003, the Cartoon Network bought the rights to show old Family Guy episodes on their late-night programming block called Adult Swim. Adult Swim was where they showed cartoons aimed at teenagers and adults, not little kids. Shows like Aqua Teen Hunger Force and C-Lab 2021 aired there. When Family Guy started showing up on Adult Swim in April 2003, something crazy happened. The show became the highest-rated program on the entire network. Not just popular, the highest rated. The viewership for Adult Swim went up by 239%, more than double. People were staying up late just to watch reruns of a cancelled cartoon. At the exact same time, something else was happening. Fox had released the 1st and 2nd seasons of Family Guy on DVD. Remember, this was 2003, when people still bought physical DVDs and didn't just stream everything online. Those DVD sets absolutely exploded in sales. The first season sold 400,000 copies in just the first month. Eventually, the season 1 and 2 DVD sets sold 2.2 million copies combined. That made them the best-selling television DVDs of 2003. Think about that. A cancelled show was outselling shows that were still on the air and making new episodes. Fox executives noticed. You don't ignore numbers like that. Here was a show they had thrown away, and it was making them money hand over fist through reruns and DVD sales. Fans weren't just watching old episodes, they were buying them, re-watching them, telling their friends about them. Family Guy had built a massive cult following during its time off the air. The network realised they had made a huge mistake. So on May 20th, 2004, Fox did something that had never really been done before in television history. They ordered 35 new episodes of Family Guy. The show was coming back from the dead. And the reason it was coming back was specifically because of DVD sales and syndication numbers. This had never happened before. Shows got revived because of fan campaigns or because a new network picked them up, but never because people bought the DVDs in such huge numbers. The first new episode was called North by North Quahog, and it aired on May 1st, 2005. 3 years had passed since the last original episode. The episode even made a joke about the cancellation right at the start. Peter tells his family they are being cancelled because Fox needed to make room for a huge list of failed shows. Dark Angel, Titus, Undeclared, Action, That 80s Show, Wonderfalls, Fastlane, Andy Richter Controls the Universe, Firefly, and a bunch of others. Lois asks if there's any hope of coming back, and Peter says maybe if all those shows get cancelled. And they did get cancelled, which is why Family Guy returned. That first episode back brought in 11.85 million viewers. That was the highest ratings Family Guy had gotten since the very first season. People were excited. The fans who had kept the show alive through DVD purchases and late-night Adult Swim viewings were ready for new content. Seth MacFarlane, the creator, said in interviews that the 3-year break was probably good for the show. He explained that animated shows don't normally get breaks, and by the end of their seasons, you can see the staff is burned out with too many sex jokes and bathroom humour because their brains are fried. With the break, everyone came back refreshed and ready to make the show they remembered. But something had shifted. The new Family Guy that came back in 2005 was not quite the same show that had been cancelled in 2002. At first, the changes were small and hard to notice. But as Season 4 went on, and then Seasons 5, 6 and 7, people started realising the show felt different. The tone had changed. The characters had changed. Everything had changed. Writers who study television have a specific way to describe what happened. They say the characters gained an edge of cruelty to them. They became broader versions of their earlier incarnations. What this means in normal language is that the characters became meaner and more extreme. Peter wasn't just a lovable idiot anymore. He was becoming actively cruel and way stupider than before. Brian wasn't just a smart dog who offered good advice. He was becoming preachy and pretentious, using big words and talking down to everyone. Stewie stopped being an evil genius baby who built time machines and death rays, and started being a character who existed mainly for gay jokes and to hang out with Brian. The cutaway gags, which had always been a part of Family Guy's style, started happening more and more frequently. In the early seasons, cutaways were used carefully. They were unexpected and actually connected to what was happening in the story, even if the connection was weird. Now the cutaways started feeling random and forced. Characters would say, "This reminds me of the time," and then cut to something that had nothing to do with anything. Sometimes the cutaways would last for minutes at a time, completely stopping whatever story was happening. The most infamous example was when the show would cut to actual video footage of country singer Conway Twitty performing a song. These clips would go on for 2 or 3 minutes, with no jokes, no animation, nothing. Just old, grainy footage of a dead country singer. It was the laziest thing many viewers had ever seen on a professional television show. The heart started disappearing from episodes too. In the early seasons, episodes would end with a character learning something, or the family coming together. Even when the lesson was silly or got undercut by a joke, there was still an attempt at emotional payoff. After the revival, episodes started ending with quick, mean-spirited jokes, or just stopping without any real conclusion. The writers seemed less interested in making the characters grow, or change, or learn anything. Everything was about getting to the next joke, and whether that joke made sense or connected to the story didn't matter anymore. Fans started noticing these changes and talking about them online. The general agreement among people who had watched from the beginning was that seasons 1 through 5 were the golden era of Family Guy. Some people extended that to include seasons 6 and 7, but most agreed that season 8 was where things really went wrong. Season 8 started in September 2009, and by this point, the show had been back from cancellation for 4 years. The characters people had loved were becoming shells of themselves. Peter was getting meaner and dumber with every episode. The show was relying more and more on shock value and gross-out humour instead of clever writing and pop culture references. What makes this particularly interesting is that Fox had learned from their mistake about cancelling Family Guy. The network was never going to cancel it again, no matter what. The show made too much money. Even if the quality went down, even if ratings dropped a bit, Family Guy was still profitable through DVD sales, merchandise, and reruns. Fox executives called it their cash cow. So there was no pressure on the writers to keep the quality high. They knew the show wasn't going anywhere. They could do whatever they wanted. Seth MacFarlane himself was getting pulled in different directions. He had created a second show called American Dad that premiered in 2005, the same year Family Guy came back. Then in 2009, he created The Cleveland Show, a spin-off of Family Guy, focusing on Peter's friend Cleveland. MacFarlane was now running 3 animated shows at the same time. Plus, he was starting to work on movies and other projects. His attention was divided. He couldn't focus on Family Guy the way he had in the early seasons, when it was his only show and he was just trying to keep it on the air. The writing staff had changed too. Some of the original writers who had worked on seasons 1 through 3 were gone. New writers came in who had different ideas about what the show should be. They had watched Family Guy on Adult Swim and on DVD, and they had their own vision for it. That vision wasn't always the same as what the original creators had intended. The show became a strange mix of trying to recapture what had worked before, while also trying to be bigger, louder, and more shocking. Looking back now, the 2005 revival was both the best and worst thing that could have happened to Family Guy. It was the best thing because the show got to continue and millions of people got to enjoy more episodes. It was the worst thing because the show that came back was already starting to lose what made it special in the first place. The 3-year gap between 2002 and 2005 created a clean break between what Family Guy was and what it would become. On one side of that break was a clever, sometimes heartfelt show about a dysfunctional family with funny cutaways. On the other side was a show that would increasingly rely on shock value, lazy writing, and characters who barely resembled who they used to be. Fans debate to this day exactly when Family Guy stopped being good. Some say it was immediately after season 3, so they only count the original run as worth watching. Some say season 5 was the last truly good season. Others extend it to season 7, but almost everyone agrees that something fundamental changed when the show came back. The DNA was different. The soul was different. Family Guy had been given a second chance at life, but in the process, it had lost something essential that it would never quite get back. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But the revival itself wasn't the only problem. The real trouble started when the person who created the entire show stopped writing for it completely. That's a story that would unfold over the next few years, fundamentally changing how Family Guy got made and why it started feeling so different from what fans remembered. Section 2. Seth MacFarlane stopped writing scripts in 2010. When Family Guy first started in 1999, Seth MacFarlane was everywhere in the show. He created it, he wrote for it, he directed episodes, he voiced Peter Griffin, the main character. He also voiced Brian the dog, Stewie the baby, and Glenn Quagmire. MacFarlane was the driving creative force behind every single aspect of the show. If you watched an early episode of Family Guy, you were watching Seth MacFarlane's vision come to life, exactly as he imagined it. His fingerprints were on everything from the jokes, to the timing, to the way characters moved and talked. This level of involvement continued through the show's cancellation and into the early years of the revival. During seasons 4, 5 and 6, MacFarlane was still heavily involved in the writing room, coming up with story ideas, reviewing scripts, and making sure episodes matched his vision for what Family Guy should be. But then something changed. Slowly, quietly, without most fans even noticing at first, MacFarlane started pulling away from the day-to-day creative work of making Family Guy. The bombshell revelation came in September 2017. MacFarlane was doing an AMA on Reddit, which stands for Ask Me Anything. It's where famous people go online and answer questions from random users. Someone asked him about his involvement with Family Guy, and MacFarlane dropped a piece of information that shocked longtime fans. He said, and this is a direct quote, "I had not written for the show since 2010. Read that again. The creator of Family Guy, the person who invented Peter and Stewie and Brian, and the entire world of Quahog, had not actually written a script for his own show in 7 years by the time he said this. And this wasn't just him taking a break for a few months. By 2017, it had been 7 full years since MacFarlane had sat down and written an actual episode of Family Guy. If you do the math, that means every single episode from season 9 onward, from 2010 to 2017 and beyond, was written entirely by other people. MacFarlane wasn't writing anymore. He wasn't in the writer's room coming up with jokes and plot ideas. He was doing other things. So what was he doing? According to MacFarlane and the show's executive producers, his role had changed completely. Instead of writing, he was focusing on two things: production and voice acting. Production means the business side of making the show, dealing with the network, approving budgets, making sure episodes got finished on time, that sort of thing. Voice acting means he still came into the recording studio to perform the voices for Peter, Brian, Stewie and Quagmire. But that's it. He wasn't coming up with the stories those characters were telling. He wasn't writing the jokes they were saying. He was just reading lines that other people had written. Alex Sulkin, one of the executive producers and showrunners of Family Guy, talked about this change in an interview. A showrunner is basically the person in charge of the day-to-day operation of making a TV show. Sulkin explained that when he first started working on Family Guy, MacFarlane was incredibly hands-on. MacFarlane would be in every meeting, involved in every decision, giving notes on every script. But as the years went on, MacFarlane's time became more and more limited. Sulkin said, "We have a great relationship with him, but he comes in and does the voices, and then he will also let us know the things that he likes and doesn't like about the show. Then he will occasionally pitch us a story idea, which instantly goes in the pipeline." Notice the word occasionally in there. MacFarlane would occasionally pitch a story idea. Not regularly, not often, occasionally. And when he did pitch an idea, it would automatically get made into an episode because, well, he's Seth MacFarlane. But these occasional pitches were the exception, not the rule. Rich Apple, another executive producer, confirmed this in the same interview. He explained that MacFarlane basically has to know what's going on in the show because he voices so many of the main characters. When MacFarlane comes in to record voices, he needs to understand the context of what his characters are saying, but that's different from actually creating the content. Appel said their relationship with MacFarlane had evolved over the years. That's a polite way of saying MacFarlane had stepped way back from his original role. The big question is, why did this happen? Why would the creator of a successful show stop writing for it? The answer is that MacFarlane got incredibly busy with other projects. When Family Guy came back in 2005, MacFarlane was already working on a second animated show called American Dad. That show premiered in February 2005, just a few months before Family Guy's revival. So right from the start of the revival, MacFarlane was splitting his attention between two shows. Then in 2009, MacFarlane created a third animated show. This one was called The Cleveland Show, and it was a direct spin-off of Family Guy. The show focused on Cleveland Brown, who had been Peter's friend and neighbour in Family Guy. Cleveland moved to Virginia with his family, and the new show followed their adventures. The Cleveland Show ran from 2009 to 2013, meaning for 4 years, MacFarlane was running 3 animated sitcoms at the same time. That's 3 different writing staffs to manage, 3 different sets of voice actors to work with, 3 different production schedules to keep track of. But it wasn't just the other animated shows. MacFarlane started branching out into movies. In 2012, he wrote, directed, produced and starred in a movie called Ted. It was about a teddy bear that comes to life and becomes best friends with a loser played by Mark Wahlberg. The movie was a huge hit, making over $500 million worldwide. MacFarlane followed it up with a sequel, Ted 2, in 2015. He also directed A Million Ways to Die in the West in 2014, a comedy western where he starred alongside Charlize Theron. Then there was The Orville. This was MacFarlane's passion project, a live-action science fiction show that was basically Star Trek, but with comedy. MacFarlane created it, produced it, and starred in it as the captain of a spaceship. The show premiered in 2017 and ran for 3 seasons. Making a live-action show is way more time-consuming than an animated show, because you have to actually be on set every day, in costume, acting in scenes. MacFarlane also got into other projects. He hosted the Oscars in 2013. He made albums where he sang old jazz standards. He worked on a reboot of the classic science fiction show Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson. He started developing other shows and movies. The guy was everywhere, doing everything, except sitting in the Family Guy writer's room. In 2020, MacFarlane signed a massive deal with NBC Universal, $200 million over 5 years. This deal was for him to create new content for NBC Universal's streaming service, Peacock. That's a lot of money, and it came with a lot of responsibilities. MacFarlane was now contractually obligated to focus his creative energy on projects for a completely different company than the one that made Family Guy. All of this meant that Family Guy was running on autopilot. The show had become a well-oiled machine, that could produce episodes without MacFarlane being actively involved in the creative process. The writing staff knew the formula, they knew the characters, they could write episodes that sounded like Family Guy without MacFarlane having to be in the room. But here's the problem. Just because they could make episodes that sounded like Family Guy didn't mean those episodes had the same quality or heart as the ones MacFarlane had directly worked on. Think about it like this. Imagine your favourite restaurant has an amazing chef who created all the recipes. The food is incredible. Then the chef decides to open 5 more restaurants in different cities. He can't be in the kitchen at the original restaurant anymore because he's too busy, so he trains other cooks to follow his recipes exactly. The food might taste similar, but something is missing. The passion, the attention to detail, the little adjustments the chef would make, all of that is gone. The new cooks are just following instructions. That's what happened to Family Guy. The writing staff that took over after 2010 was talented, but they had a different understanding of the show than MacFarlane did. Many of them had joined the show after the revival in 2005. They hadn't been there for the original run from 1999 to 2002. Their experience of Family Guy was the later seasons, the ones that were already starting to change. So when they wrote new episodes, they were basing their work on the changed version of the show, not the original vision. This led to a cycle where the show kept drifting further and further from what it had been. Season 9 was based on seasons 4 through 8. Season 10 was based on season 9. Season 11 was based on season 10. Each new season was a copy of a copy of a copy, and with each generation, something got lost in the translation. There's also the issue of the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike. This was a massive strike where television and movie writers across Hollywood stopped working to fight for better pay and benefits. The strike lasted 100 days, from November 2007 to February 2008. During this time, no scripts were being written for any shows, including Family Guy. When the strike ended and work resumed, some writers didn't come back. Others had moved on to different projects. The writing staff that had been building chemistry and developing the show's voice got disrupted and never quite recovered. MacFarlane himself participated in the strike, walking the picket lines to support the writers, but when production resumed, he was already stretched thin between multiple projects. The strike created a natural breaking point where MacFarlane could step back from the writing process without it seeming weird or sudden. The show had been paused anyway. When it came back, MacFarlane could redefine his role, focusing on the parts that only he could do, the voices, and letting other people handle the writing. Then, in 2023, another Writers Guild strike happened. This time, MacFarlane and the showrunners for both Family Guy and American Dad made it clear to the studio that they wouldn't be working on the shows at all while the strike was happening. MacFarlane was seen on the picket lines again supporting the writers. When the strike ended in September 2023, they all went back to work, but by this point, MacFarlane's reduced involvement was just how things worked. It was the new normal. The impact of MacFarlane's absence from the writer's room can't be overstated. When the creator of a show stops writing for it, the show loses its North Star. The writers don't have someone who can definitively say, "This is what Peter would do," or "This joke doesn't fit the world we've created." Instead, they're making their best guesses based on what they think MacFarlane would want, and sometimes they guess wrong. You can see this in how the characters started behaving differently. Peter became crueler and stupider because the writers thought that's what made him funny. They didn't have MacFarlane there to say, "Wait, Peter is dumb, but he loves his family. He wouldn't actually do this." Brian became more preachy and political because the writers knew MacFarlane had liberal political views, so they turned Brian into a mouthpiece for those views, without the nuance or humour that MacFarlane would have added. The cutaway gags became more random and less connected to the story because the writers were just trying to come up with funny scenes, not worrying about whether they made sense in context. The emotional moments disappeared because the writers were focused on jokes, and more jokes, without MacFarlane there to remind them that the show needed heart too. It's also worth noting that MacFarlane has said in interviews that he's wanted to end Family Guy for years, but Fox won't let him. The network makes too much money from the show to cancel it, even if the creator himself thinks it should end. MacFarlane is stuck voicing characters for a show that he's no longer creatively invested in, reading scripts he didn't write, for stories he didn't create. You can almost hear it in his performances sometimes. The energy isn't quite the same as it was in the early seasons. The sad truth is that Family Guy became a show running on the fumes of its former glory. The brand was strong enough to keep going without MacFarlane's active involvement. People kept watching because they remembered when the show was great, hoping it would return to form. But without the person who made it great in the first place actively working on it, that return to form was never going to happen. By 2010, when MacFarlane wrote his last script, Family Guy had already been declining for a couple of years, but his departure from the writer's room sealed the deal. The show would continue for many more years, and is still going as of 2026. But it would never again be what it was when MacFarlane was fully invested in making every episode the best it could be. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The absence of the creator was a huge part of why modern Family Guy felt so different from classic Family Guy. But MacFarlane's reduced involvement didn't just affect the overall quality of the show, it also meant there was nobody to stop the characters from turning into warped, extreme versions of themselves. And no character suffered from this more than Peter Griffin himself. Section 3. Peter Griffin's catastrophic transformation. In the first season of Family Guy, there's an episode called A Hero Sits Next Door, where Peter gets jealous of Joe Swanson, his new neighbour who's a cop and happens to use a wheelchair. Throughout the episode, Peter acts like an idiot trying to compete with Joe and prove he's just as good. But at the end, Peter realises he's been a jerk. He admits he was wrong. He apologises. The episode ends with Peter understanding that he doesn't need to compete with anyone. His family loves him for who he is. It's a simple lesson, but Peter actually learns it. Now imagine that same episode happening in season 15. Peter would probably do something 10 times worse than just being jealous. He might intentionally hurt Joe. He might destroy Joe's house. He might do something so cruel and insane that you'd wonder why Lois doesn't divorce him and why Joe doesn't arrest him. And at the end of the episode, Peter wouldn't learn anything. He wouldn't apologise. He'd probably make a joke about what he did, and everyone would move on like nothing happened. That's the difference between early Peter Griffin and modern Peter Griffin. Peter Griffin started as a character inspired by guys you might actually know. He was based on the kind of dad who means well but screws things up a lot. He was overweight and lazy. He drank too much beer with his buddies. He made dumb decisions. But underneath all of that, Peter loved his wife Lois. He loved his kids, even Meg. When his family was in real trouble, Peter would step up and try to fix things. He wasn't a great dad, but he was trying his best, and that made him likeable even when he was doing stupid stuff. Seth MacFarlane based Peter's voice on a security guard he heard talking while he was in college at the Rhode Island School of Design. The voice was sort of slow and dopey, with that distinctive Rhode Island accent, but the voice matched the character. Peter sounded like a regular working-class guy, because that's what he was supposed to be. He worked at a toy factory called the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory. He had a simple job and a simple life, and the comedy came from him trying to deal with situations that were way over his head. In the early seasons, Peter's stupidity had limits. Yes, he was an idiot, but he was a realistic kind of idiot. He would misunderstand things or make bad choices, but you could follow his logic even when it was wrong. In one episode, he thinks he can build a pool in his backyard by himself. It's a dumb idea, but it's the kind of dumb idea an overconfident guy might actually have. The pool ends up terrible, things go wrong, and Peter learns he should have hired professionals. That's early Peter in a nutshell. Dumb ideas, bad execution, lesson learned. The first major crack in Peter's character came in an episode from season 4 called Petarded. The title is a play on a very offensive word that we're not going to repeat here, but it basically means someone who is mentally slow. In this episode, Peter starts acting even duller than usual. His family gets worried, so they take him to a doctor to get his brain tested. The doctor runs some tests and declares that Peter is actually legally mentally disabled, not just dumb, like officially, medically disabled. This episode aired in 2005, right after the show came back from cancellation, and it changed everything about Peter's character. Before Petarded, Peter was just a moron. After Petarded, the show had given itself permission to make Peter as stupid as they wanted because, hey, he's literally disabled. He can't help it. This meant the writers could have Peter do absolutely anything, no matter how ridiculous or impossible, and just shrug it off by saying Peter's disabled. Peter started doing things that no human being could actually survive or accomplish. He would forget how to breathe. He would eat inedible objects. He would fail to understand the most basic concepts that even a small child would know. His intelligence didn't just drop a little bit, it fell off a cliff. Early Peter was dumb. Post-petarded Peter was something else entirely. But it wasn't just the stupidity that changed. Peter's personality got darker, a lot darker. In early episodes, Peter genuinely cared about Meg. There's a moment in one episode where he says he would take a bullet for her. That's his daughter, and despite all his flaws, he loves her. But starting around season 6 and definitely by season 8, Peter became actively abusive toward Meg. He started saying, "Shut up, Meg," constantly. He would insult her. He would physically hurt her. He seemed to actually hate his own daughter, and the show played it for laughs. The abuse wasn't limited to Meg either. Peter became cruel to everyone around him. He would hurt his friends for no reason. He would destroy property. He would commit actual crimes, assault, theft, you name it, and face zero consequences. In one episode, Peter literally crushes children to death and hides their bodies under his bed. In another, he cuts people up with a chainsaw. These aren't cutaway gags or fantasies. These things happen in the actual episodes, and nobody seems to care. What makes this so disturbing is that early Peter would never do any of this. Early Peter might accidentally hurt someone, feel bad about it, and try to make it right. Modern Peter hurts people on purpose and doesn't care at all. He's become what people call a psychopathic man-child, someone with the emotional development of a little kid, but the lack of empathy of a psychopath. He does whatever he wants, whenever he wants, with no regard for how it affects anyone else. The writers seem to forget that Peter needed to have some redeeming qualities to be a main character people actually wanted to watch. Homer Simpson from The Simpsons is often compared to Peter because they're both overweight, lazy, dumb dads. But Homer, even at his worst, loves his family. He makes mistakes and does stupid things, but when push comes to shove, Homer would do anything for Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie. You can see it in almost every episode. Peter used to have that same quality. Modern Peter doesn't. In fact, people started calling Peter a corrupted character copy of Homer Simpson. They're similar on the surface, both fat, both dumb, both alcoholic, both cause trouble. But Homer usually means well and tries to be better. Peter actively enjoys causing chaos and pain. Homer is a buffoon. Peter is a monster. The difference between them shows how far Peter fell from what he used to be. There's an episode from season 11 called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, where Quagmire's sister is being abused by her boyfriend. Peter and the gang have to help her escape the abusive relationship. The episode tries to treat domestic violence seriously. But here's the thing. Peter himself is emotionally and physically abusive to his own family in practically every episode. How is he supposed to be the hero helping someone escape abuse when he's an abuser himself? The show didn't seem to notice or care about this massive contradiction. Around season 8, which started in 2009, Peter's transformation was complete. If you watch an episode from season 2 and then immediately watch an episode from season 10, you're watching two completely different characters who just happen to have the same name and voice. Early Peter was a lovable loser, later Peter was an unlikable nightmare. The problem got worse because Peter dominates the show. He's the main character. Most episodes revolve around him. When Peter was funny and likable, that worked great. When Peter became insufferable, it dragged the entire show down with him. You couldn't avoid him. He was in almost every scene, being terrible, and you were just supposed to find it funny. What's weird is that the show would occasionally have episodes where Peter would revert back to his old personality. He'd be nice to Meg. He'd show he cared about his family. He'd learn a lesson. These episodes felt like the writers suddenly remembered what Peter used to be like. But then the very next episode, Peter would be back to being a cruel idiot again. There was no consistency. It was like the writers couldn't decide if they wanted Peter to be redeemable or not, so they just did whatever they felt like each week. By season 15, 16 and beyond, some episodes tried to dial back Peter's worst behaviour. He started being slightly nicer to Meg. He had moments where he seemed to care about his family again. But it was too little, too late. The damage was done. Peter had spent years being such an awful person that even when the show tried to soften him, viewers couldn't forget all the terrible things he'd done. It's hard to root for a character who spent a decade being absolutely horrible. There's also the fact that Peter never faces real consequences for his actions. In early seasons, if Peter did something really bad, something bad would happen to him because of it. Cause and effect. You do something stupid, you pay the price. That's basic storytelling, and it also made Peter's behaviour feel fair. Sure, he's an idiot, but he suffers for it, so we're even. Modern Peter doesn't suffer consequences. He can commit felonies, hurt people, destroy things, and everything just resets by the next episode. He still has his job, even though he's terrible at it and barely shows up. He still has his wife, even though he treats her badly. His friends still hang out with him, even though he's awful to them. Nothing matters. Peter exists in a consequence-free zone where he can do literally anything with no real repercussions. This made Peter feel less like a character and more like a cartoon in the worst sense of the word. Early Peter existed in a world with rules. Modern Peter exists in chaos, where nothing means anything. And when nothing means anything, why should the audience care about what happens? The voice acting even changed subtly. Seth MacFarlane still voices Peter, and he's a talented voice actor, so the voice itself sounds the same, but the energy behind it shifted. Early Peter sounded enthusiastic and kind of innocent, even when he was doing dumb things. Modern Peter often sounds mean or angry. The tone changed to match the character's personality shift. Fans of the show noticed all of this happening in real time. Online forums and social media sites were filled with people asking, "What happened to Peter?" and "Why is Peter so mean now?" Some people stopped watching the show entirely because they couldn't stand what Peter had become. Others kept watching out of habit, but they didn't enjoy it the same way. Peter had gone from one of the most beloved cartoon dads to one of the most hated. Critics started calling Peter one of the worst characters in television history. Not worst as in badly written for a show that's trying to be good, but worst as in genuinely unpleasant to watch. He ranked on lists of most annoying TV characters and characters who got worse over time. People who had Peter Griffin t-shirts and toys from the early 2000s were embarrassed to wear them or display them because of what the character had turned into. The transformation of Peter Griffin is probably the single clearest example of what went wrong with Family Guy. When your main character goes from lovable to hateable, when he loses all his redeeming qualities and becomes a one-note joke machine who exists only to do shocking things, you've lost the heart of your show. Peter was the anchor that held Family Guy together. When he changed this drastically, everything else fell apart around him. Think about other long-running sitcoms. The main characters might get a little different over time, but they stay fundamentally the same. You can watch the first and last episodes of a show like The Office, and while Michael Scott has definitely grown and changed, he's still recognisably the same character. The same can't be said for Peter Griffin. Early Peter and late Peter are two completely different people. The saddest part is that it didn't have to be this way. The writers could have kept Peter dumb but kind. They could have kept him making mistakes but learning from them. They could have maintained the balance that made him funny in the first place. But somewhere along the way, they decided that making Peter as extreme as possible was funnier than keeping him grounded and human. They were wrong. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Peter's downfall didn't happen in isolation though. While he was transforming into a monster, the show's writing was getting lazier in other ways, and nothing showed that laziness more clearly than a running gag involving a dead country singer that would end up becoming the most hated joke in Family Guy history. Section 4. Conway Twitty, the laziest gag in television history. Imagine you're watching your favourite show. Something funny just happened and you're enjoying yourself. Then suddenly, without warning, the show cuts away to grainy old footage of some random country singer you've never heard of, performing a song from the 1970s. The song plays, and plays, and keeps playing, for 3 full minutes. No jokes, no animation, no nothing. Just an old music video. You sit there wondering if something went wrong with your TV. Maybe the channel changed by accident? But no, this is actually part of the episode. This actually happened on Family Guy over and over again, and it made fans angrier than almost anything else the show ever did. The singer was Conway Twitty. He was a real country music star who had a very successful career from the 1950s until he died in 1993. Twitty had 55 #1 country hits, which was a record until George Strait broke it in 2006. He was inducted into both the Country Music Hall of Fame and the Rockabilly Hall of Fame. By all accounts, Conway Twitty was a talented musician who made a lot of people happy with his music. None of what Family Guy did with his image was his fault. He'd been dead for 6 years when the show first started using his footage. The Conway Twitty gag first appeared in an episode from Season 8 called Bill and Peter's Bogus Journey. In this episode, Peter and former President Bill Clinton get high on marijuana and steal a live pig because they have the munchies and want to eat it. A pig farmer catches them, makes a joke that doesn't really land, and then says something like, "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Conway Twitty." The show then cuts to actual old footage of Conway Twitty on stage, performing a song. The song plays for a while, and then the show cuts back to the actual cartoon. When this first happened, some viewers probably thought it was kind of funny, in a weird, random way. Family Guy had always done unexpected cutaway gags, so cutting to random old footage wasn't completely out of character for the show. But then it happened again, and again, and again. The Conway Twitty gag became a recurring thing, showing up in multiple episodes across different seasons, and each time it appeared, it got longer and more annoying. The absolute worst example came in an episode called The Juice is Loose from Season 7. This episode aired in March 2009 and was about Peter winning a chance to play golf with O.J. Simpson. At one point in the episode, Peter introduces Conway Twitty, and the show cuts to footage of Twitty performing a song called I See the Want To in Your Eyes. The performance goes on for 3 full minutes. 3 full minutes. That's an incredibly long time in a show that's only about 22 minutes long without commercials. It's more than 10% of the entire episode. To understand how lazy this is, you need to understand how animated shows are made. Creating animation is expensive and time-consuming. Artists have to draw the characters, animate their movements, add colours, add backgrounds, and sync everything up with the voice acting. It takes a lot of work and costs a lot of money. But if you just show old footage from a concert that happened decades ago, that costs basically nothing. You don't have to animate anything. You don't have to write jokes. You don't have to do any creative work at all. You just slap in some old video footage and call it a day. Fans immediately recognised this for what it was, pure laziness. The writers and producers were filling up airtime with content that required zero effort on their part. It was like a student writing a book report and copying 3 pages directly from the book to meet the page requirement. You're technically filling space, but you're not actually doing the work you're supposed to be doing. The reviews for The Juice is Loose were brutal, and most of the criticism focused specifically on the Conway Twitty segment. IGN, a major entertainment website, gave the episode a 5.5 out of 10. The reviewer said the episode was a largely forgettable episode with only a few moments of brilliance, and called out the Conway Twitty clip as an effort to reduce the amount of animation for the episode. TV Guide was even harsher. Their reviewer said he did enjoy this episode, but called the Conway Twitty clip straight up filler. Then he said something really damning. He would have preferred to see a blank screen or even commercials instead of the Conway Twitty footage. Think about that. A professional TV critic said he would rather watch advertisements for products he doesn't want than watch Conway Twitty perform. That's how bad it was. Another critic from the AV Club, a respected entertainment site, said the episode relied on an overabundance of pop culture references far too dated to elicit much more than a brief chuckle. He also specifically criticised the Conway Twitty clip as one of the episode's major problems. But the critics weren't alone in hating this gag. Regular fans absolutely despised it. On internet forums, message boards and social media, people complained constantly about Conway Twitty. Some said they would fast forward through it if they were watching on DVR. Others said they'd change the channel and come back in a few minutes, hoping it would be over. People were so bored by the gag that they literally wouldn't watch it. One common complaint was that most Family Guy viewers had no idea who Conway Twitty even was. The show's audience was mostly teenagers and young adults. Conway Twitty's music was popular in the 1970s and 1980s, which meant the people watching Family Guy in 2009 were either not born yet or were little kids when Twitty was at his peak. To them, this was just some random old guy singing boring old songs. There was no nostalgia factor. There was no reference they were getting. It was just dead air as far as they were concerned. The laziness of the gag became even more obvious when you learned what Seth MacFarlane himself said about it. According to people who worked on the show and various internet discussions, MacFarlane basically admitted that the Conway Twitty bits were deliberately low effort. The joke wasn't really the music, or Conway Twitty himself. The joke was supposedly that the writers were being so lazy and making the audience sit through something boring on purpose, like, haha, we're wasting your time and there's nothing you can do about it. Some fans defended this, saying it was clever meta humor. The show was making fun of itself for being lazy by being intentionally lazy, but most people didn't buy this excuse. Just because you're being lazy on purpose doesn't make it not lazy, and it definitely doesn't make it funny. It just makes you a show that's wasting people's time. There was also a story going around that MacFarlane used the Conway Twitty gag as a way to essentially give Fox the middle finger. The network wanted 22 minutes of content per episode, and MacFarlane was delivering 22 minutes of content. It's just that some of that content was old concert footage instead of actual original animation and writing. It was technically meeting the requirements while putting in minimal effort. Whether this story is true or not, it certainly matched what viewers were seeing on screen. The fact that this gag kept appearing in multiple episodes made it even worse. It wasn't a one-time weird choice. It became a running gag that the show kept coming back to. Besides The Juice is Loose, Conway Twitty appeared in other episodes with different songs. Sometimes it was just for a minute or so, other times it went on longer. The show even started doing variations on the gag, like putting a Justin Bieber wig on Conway Twitty in one episode, or putting him in a Darth Vader helmet in one of the Star Wars parody episodes. Eventually, even Family Guy itself acknowledged that people hated the Conway Twitty gag. In an episode called 3 Acts of God, God himself appears and tells Peter that Conway Twitty wants them to knock off with the recurring gags involving him. The show was literally admitting through one of its own characters that the gag had worn out. It's welcome. But even this admission didn't stop them from bringing it back in later episodes. In another episode called Peter, Chris and Brian, a teenage version of Peter starts to play a Conway Twitty song, and adult Peter immediately cuts it off and calls it annoying. Again, the show was openly acknowledging that its own recurring gag was annoying. But instead of just stopping, they kept doing it while making fun of themselves for doing it. This is like someone punching you in the arm, saying, I know this is annoying, and then continuing to punch you in the arm. There were other long cutaway gags that people hated too. The show would sometimes cut to the entire intro sequence of some old 1970s TV show that nobody remembered, or they'd show a long scene of someone trying to open plastic wrap, which went on forever as a joke about how annoying plastic wrap is. The Hudson Brothers TV show intro was shown in full in one episode. None of these were as infamous as Conway Twitty, but they all came from the same place: writers trying to fill time without actually writing jokes or creating new animation. What made these gags particularly frustrating is that they killed the momentum of whatever story was happening. Family Guy episodes usually had an A plot and a B plot, two different stories happening at the same time. Maybe Peter is trying to do something crazy, and meanwhile Stewie and Brian are on an adventure. The plots would weave together, build tension, and hopefully pay off in a funny way. But when you shove a 3-minute Conway Twitty performance right in the middle of your story, you destroy all that momentum. The audience forgets what was happening, they lose interest, and when the show finally comes back from the musical interlude, nobody cares anymore. This was especially bad for people watching the show when it originally aired on TV. If you were watching on your computer or on DVD, you could fast forward through the boring parts. But if you were watching on live television, you were stuck. You had to either sit there and endure Conway Twitty, or change the channel and risk missing the rest of the episode. It was a lose-lose situation. Executive producer Chris Sheridan even had to explain to Fox executives why they should allow the Conway Twitty segments in episodes. The fact that he had to justify it to the network shows that even the people paying for the show weren't sure this was a good idea. But somehow, Sheridan convinced them, and the gag kept appearing. Looking back at the Conway Twitty era of Family Guy, it's hard to find anyone who has anything nice to say about it. Critics hated it, fans hated it. Even the show itself seemed to know it was bad. So why did they keep doing it? The most logical explanation is that it was easy and saved money. Instead of paying writers to write more jokes and paying animators to animate more scenes, they could just drop in some free old footage and call it comedy. The Conway Twitty gag represents everything that went wrong with modern Family Guy in miniature. It was lazy. It showed contempt for the audience. It wasted time that could have been used for actual storytelling or jokes. It kept happening even after everyone said they hated it, and it symbolised a show that had stopped trying to be good and was just going through the motions, doing the bare minimum to produce episodes and collect paychecks. By the early 2000s, the Conway Twitty gag had mostly disappeared from the show. They'd bring it back occasionally as a reference or a quick joke, but the days of 3-minute concert performances were over. The damage was done though. A whole generation of Family Guy fans had been trained to expect the show to waste their time with pointless, unfunny segments that served no purpose except to fill up airtime. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Conway Twitty wasn't the only character who suffered from the show's declining standards though. While the writers were busy being lazy with random country singers, they were also completely destroying the character who was supposed to be the smart one, the voice of reason, the one character who could cut through everyone else's nonsense and tell the truth. Brian Griffin, the talking dog who went from the show's conscience to its most insufferable character. Section 5. Brian Griffin became a political soapbox. When Family Guy started, Brian Griffin was the character everyone could relate to. He was a dog, yes, but he acted more human than any of the actual humans in the Griffin family. While Peter was doing something idiotic, and Lois was pretending everything was fine and the kids were being weird, Brian was the one who would step back, look at the camera, and basically say what the audience was thinking. He was smart. He was educated. He read books. He had opinions about art and culture and politics, but he wasn't annoying about it. Brian was the character who made the show work because he was the normal one, surrounded by crazy people. In the early episodes, Brian had a lot going on as a character. He was a struggling writer who had never actually finished a novel. He was an alcoholic, but it was played for laughs. He'd drink martinis and make jokes about needing a drink. He had a weird, uncomfortable crush on Lois, Peter's wife, which created awkward moments but also funny situations. He dated different women and usually screwed up those relationships somehow. He was Peter's best friend, even though Peter was an idiot and Brian was smart. That friendship was actually kind of sweet, because you could see that Brian genuinely cared about Peter, despite all his flaws. Most importantly, Brian served a specific purpose in the show. When Peter or another character would do something completely insane, Brian would be the one to point out how insane it was. He was the voice of reason. If the show was getting too crazy or too silly, Brian would ground it by reacting like a normal person would react. This balance was important because it made the crazy stuff funnier. You need someone to be the straight man in comedy, and Brian was that person. Brian was also shown to be a good friend and a decent guy overall. He would help people. He would give advice. When someone in the family was going through something difficult, Brian would be there to support them and talk them through it. He wasn't perfect. He had plenty of flaws and made plenty of mistakes, but his heart was generally in the right place. Then something started changing. Slowly at first, then faster. Brian transformed from the likable voice of reason into one of the most annoying characters on television. The shift started happening around season 7 and was in full swing by season 9. If you watch early Brian and late Brian side by side, you're looking at completely different characters. The biggest change was that Brian became what people call a soapbox for Seth MacFarlane's political views. A soapbox is what people used to stand on when they wanted to give speeches on street corners. When we say someone is using a character as a soapbox, we mean they're using that character to preach their own personal beliefs to the audience. And that's exactly what happened with Brian. Seth MacFarlane has never been shy about his political views. He's a liberal who supports democratic politicians, believes in climate change, supports gay rights, and has strong opinions about religion and atheism. There's nothing wrong with having these views. Lots of people share them. The problem came when MacFarlane started using Brian as a puppet to lecture the audience about these views in every single episode. Brian went from being a character with his own personality to being a mouthpiece for political opinions. Every episode, Brian would go on long rants about whatever political issues Seth MacFarlane cared about that week. He would talk down to other characters, explaining to them why they were wrong and he was right. He would bring up politics in situations where it made no sense to bring up politics. He stopped being a character and started being a walking opinion column. The most infamous example of this came in an episode from season 7 called Not All Dogs Go to Heaven. In this episode, Meg becomes a born-again Christian and starts going to church. Brian, who is an atheist, absolutely loses his mind about this. He doesn't just disagree with her choice. He goes on a crusade to destroy her faith and prove that religion is stupid. Throughout the episode, Brian lectures everyone about how religion is bad and religious people are idiots. He says that believing in God is the same as believing in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. He's incredibly mean and condescending to Meg, who just wanted to find some comfort and community through church. He doesn't respect her beliefs at all. He treats her like she's stupid for believing in something. The episode ends with Brian being proven right and Meg giving up on religion. There's no balance. There's no everyone has their own beliefs and that's okay. It's just Brian preaching atheism for 22 minutes and being rewarded for it. Even people who agreed with Brian's views about religion found the episode preachy and annoying. It wasn't funny. It was just Seth MacFarlane using his cartoon dog to tell people what to think. Fans and critics absolutely hated Not All Dogs Go to Heaven. It's regularly listed as one of the worst Family Guy episodes ever made. People complained that it was heavy-handed, mean-spirited, and not funny at all. The episode killed whatever likability Brian had left because it showed that he wasn't actually a voice of reason. He was just someone who thought he was smarter than everyone else and needed to prove it constantly. But the real turning point for Brian's character came in an episode called Jerome is the New Black from Season 8. This episode introduced a new character named Jerome, who was a cool, successful black guy who became friends with Peter. At one point in the episode, Glenn Quagmire, Peter's sex-obsessed neighbour, absolutely tears into Brian with a speech that fans still talk about today. Quagmire goes off on Brian for several minutes, listing every single thing that makes Brian a terrible person. He calls Brian out for pretending to be sophisticated when he's actually shallow. He points out that Brian talks about helping people, but never actually does anything. He says Brian is a terrible friend who only cares about himself. He accuses Brian of being a phony who pretends to have values but abandons them whenever it's convenient. And he brings up Brian's creepy obsession with Lois, Peter's wife, asking how Brian can claim to be Peter's friend while constantly trying to sleep with his wife. The speech was brutal, and the thing is, Quagmire was absolutely right about everything he said. Every single complaint he had about Brian was backed up by things Brian had actually done in previous episodes. The writers had accidentally turned Brian into such a bad person that another character could spend several minutes listing his flaws, and it all made perfect sense. What's interesting is that this speech was supposed to be a moment of self-awareness for the show. The writers knew they'd made Brian insufferable, and they were acknowledging it through Quagmire. But acknowledging that your character has become terrible doesn't fix the problem. Brian didn't change after this episode. If anything, he got worse. He became even more preachy, even more pretentious, even more convinced of his own superiority. Brian's alcoholism also got way worse. In early seasons, Brian would drink martinis, and it was just part of his sophisticated persona. Later seasons turned him into a full-blown drunk who couldn't function without alcohol. But instead of treating this as a serious problem, the show mostly used it for cheap jokes. Brian would get drunk and do stupid things, but there were never any real consequences. He didn't lose his job or his friends or hit rock bottom in any meaningful way. He just kept drinking and drinking, and nothing ever changed. Then there was Brian's treatment of women. In early seasons, Brian would date women and the relationships would fall apart for understandable reasons. Personality differences, bad timing, his own insecurities. Later seasons showed Brian actively lying to women to sleep with them. He would pretend to be someone he wasn't, make up fake credentials, or manipulate women emotionally to get what he wanted. And again, no real consequences. The women would find out he lied, get mad, and leave. But Brian would just move on to the next person and do the same thing. One of the most disturbing aspects of later Brian was how he treated his own son. Brian has a son named Dylan who appeared in a few episodes. Dylan was the result of a one-night stand, and Brian wanted nothing to do with him at first. Eventually, Brian tried to build a relationship with Dylan, but he was a terrible father. He would promise to spend time with Dylan and then blow him off to pursue his own interests. He'd prioritise his writing career or his dating life over his own kid. The show would occasionally point out that this was bad, but Brian never really changed his behaviour. All of these negative traits, the preaching, the pretentiousness, the lying, the drinking, the bad parenting, combined to make Brian one of the most hated characters on the show. People who used to love Brian couldn't stand him anymore. He'd gone from the character everyone related to the character everyone wanted to punch in the face. The worst part was that the show seemed to think Brian was still the voice of reason. Episodes would still have Brian giving advice or explaining things to other characters, as if he was the moral centre of the show. But the audience knew better. Brian wasn't wise or insightful. He was a hypocrite who preached about being a good person, while being selfish and terrible in his own life. There's a reason why Brian became this way. and it ties back to Seth MacFarlane's reduced involvement in the show. When MacFarlane was actively writing episodes, he understood that Brian needed to be flawed, but fundamentally decent. The character's flaws were part of what made him funny and relatable. But when MacFarlane stepped back and other writers took over, they saw Brian as a vehicle for political commentary. They knew MacFarlane had liberal views, so they turned Brian into a liberal mouthpiece without the nuance or humour that MacFarlane would have added. The writers also seem to forget that just because a character is intelligent doesn't mean they should lecture everyone all the time. Early Brian was smart, but he didn't rub it in people's faces constantly. He'd make a smart comment here or there, but he wasn't constantly explaining things or talking down to people. Later, Brian couldn't have a conversation without making someone feel stupid. Another factor was that the writers were clearly using Brian to work through their own frustrations with American politics and culture. If they were angry about something happening in the news, they'd have Brian rant about it. If they disagreed with something, they'd have Brian explain why it was wrong. This turned Brian into less of a character and more of a tool for the writers to express their own opinions. By season 12, Brian had become so unlikable that the show made a shocking decision. They killed him off. In an episode called Life of Brian, Brian gets hit by a car and dies. The family is devastated. They get a new dog named Vinny to replace him. Fans lost their minds. People were genuinely upset that Brian had been killed, even though they'd spent years complaining about how annoying he'd become. It turns out that even when people hate a character, they don't necessarily want that character to die. But here's the thing, Brian's death wasn't permanent. Just 2 episodes later, in an episode called Christmas Guy, Stewie uses time travel to go back and prevent Brian's death. Brian came back to life, and everything went back to normal. The whole thing was revealed to be a cheap stunt to get people talking about the show and boost ratings. It worked, people definitely talked about it, but it also made fans even angrier because they felt manipulated. When Brian came back, he didn't become a better character. He was still preachy and pretentious, and all the things people hated about him. The death and resurrection changed nothing, except to prove that the writers would do anything for attention, even fake kill a main character. The transformation of Brian Griffin from beloved voice of reason to insufferable know-it-all is one of the saddest character changes in the show's history. Brian used to represent the audience, the normal person reacting to the insanity around him. He became the thing the audience wanted to escape from, someone who wouldn't shut up about their political opinions and treated everyone else like they were idiots. Even people who agreed with Brian's political views found him exhausting. It's not about whether his opinions were right or wrong. It's about the fact that nobody wants to be lectured to by a cartoon dog for 22 minutes. We watch TV to laugh and be entertained, not to be told what to think about complicated political issues. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Brian wasn't the only Griffin family member whose treatment got way out of control though. While Brian was busy being insufferable, another character was going through something even worse. Years and years of constant, unrelenting abuse that went from being a running joke to something genuinely disturbing. Section 6. Shut up, Meg. When abuse stopped being funny. In the very first season of Family Guy, there's an episode called A Hero Sits Next Door, where Meg tries out for the high school football team. She's not very good at it, but Peter actually encourages her. He shows up to her game, he cheers for her. When she gets tackled hard and is lying on the ground hurt, Peter runs onto the field to check on her. He's worried about his daughter. Later in that same season, in an episode called The Sun Also Draws, Peter straight up tells Meg that he would take a bullet for her. That's his daughter, and despite being an idiot in every other way, Peter loves her and would protect her with his life. Now fast forward to season 10. There's an episode called Seahorse Seashell Party, where the family is stuck in the house during a hurricane. They're bored and start picking on Meg like they always do. But this time, Meg finally snaps. She goes off on every single member of her family, telling them exactly how terrible they are and how much she hates the way they treat her. She lists all the awful things they've done to her over the years. She tells them they're selfish, cruel, and that she deserves better. It's powerful. It's cathartic. The audience is cheering because Meg is finally standing up for herself after years of abuse. And then the episode ends with Meg apologising to her family and saying she'll go back to being their punching bag because it's what holds the family together. Brian tells her she's a hero for sacrificing herself so the rest of the family doesn't turn on each other. The moral of the episode is literally that Meg should continue accepting abuse for the good of her abusers. That's not a joke or an exaggeration. That's actually what happens in the episode. That's how far Meg Griffin's treatment had fallen from the early seasons to the later ones. She went from being a daughter her father would take a bullet for to being someone whose own family thinks she exists solely to absorb their cruelty. Meg started out as a pretty normal teenage girl character. She was unpopular at school. She was awkward and desperate to fit in. She had crushes on boys who didn't like her back. She fought with her siblings like real siblings do. She was embarrassed by her parents. All of this was standard stuff for a teenage character on a sitcom. The joke was that she was boring and normal compared to the rest of her crazy family. In early seasons, the family would make fun of Meg occasionally, but it was typical family teasing. Peter might make a dumb joke at Meg's expense, but then he'd also defend her when someone else picked on her. Lois would criticise Meg's clothes or her friends, but she'd also have mother-daughter moments with her. Chris and Stewie would mess with their sister, but they'd also team up with her sometimes. It was normal family stuff. The shift started gradually around season 4 and 5, but it really kicked into high gear around season 6. Peter started saying, "Shut up, Meg," constantly. At first, it was just occasionally. Then it became his response to almost anything Meg said. Meg would try to contribute to a conversation, and Peter would cut her off with, "Shut up, Meg." She'd try to tell a story, and he'd say, "Shut up, Meg." She'd ask a reasonable question, and he'd say, "Shut up, Meg." The line became one of Peter's catchphrases, right up there with his famous laugh. People started quoting it in real life. You could buy t-shirts that said, "Shut up, Meg," on them. It became a meme before memes were really a thing. And because it became so popular with some fans, the show kept doing it more and more. But Shut Up, Meg was just the beginning. The abuse escalated quickly. The show started having every single character treat Meg terribly. Her own mother Lois would insult her appearance and tell her she was a disappointment. Her brother Chris, who used to have a normal sibling relationship with her, started joining in on making fun of her. Even Stewie, who was just a baby, would mock Meg constantly. It wasn't just verbal abuse either. The show started having characters physically hurt Meg in increasingly disturbing ways. In one episode, Peter tasers Meg repeatedly just because he can. In another, the entire family pelts her with rotten meat while she's performing in front of her whole school. In Space Cadet, Stewie opens the bay doors of a space shuttle as a prank, and Meg gets sucked out into the vacuum of space. In multiple episodes, Peter punches Meg in the face or beats her up. The show even had a running gag where the family would just forget Meg existed. They'd go on vacation without her. They'd have family dinners and not invite her. They'd make family decisions and not include her. When she'd point out that they forgot her, they'd act like she was being annoying for wanting to be included. One of the most disturbing examples came in an episode called Dial Meg for Murder from season 13. In this episode, Meg becomes pen pals with a prisoner. When the prisoner escapes, he comes to the Griffin house to see Meg. The police find out and arrest Meg for harbouring a fugitive. She gets sent to prison for 3 months. While in prison, Meg becomes hardened and violent. She gets into fights. She becomes mean and angry. When she comes home, she's completely changed into someone scary and aggressive. You'd think the family would feel bad about what happened to Meg, right? You'd think they'd apologise for how they treated her and try to make things better. Nope, they're just annoyed that Meg is acting different. Eventually, Meg goes back to being weak and letting them abuse her, and everything returns to normal. There's another episode called Valentine's Day in Quahog, where Meg finally seems to meet a nice guy on the internet. They have a date on Valentine's Day, and everything seems to be going well. But then it turns out the whole thing was a setup. The guy was pranking her. He was never actually interested in her. He just wanted to humiliate her. And instead of the show treating this as cruel and wrong, it's played for laughs. In multiple episodes, the show has Meg trying to kill herself or being suicidal because of how her family treats her. These moments are also played for laughs. There's no acknowledgement that driving someone to suicide might be a sign that you're treating them horribly. The Star Wars parody episodes that Family Guy made actually had some of the show's best comedy, but they also showed how little respect the writers had for Meg. In these special episodes, the main characters all got to play cool Star Wars characters. Peter was Han Solo, Chris was Luke Skywalker, Stewie was Darth Vader, Brian was Chewbacca. Even Cleveland and Quagmire got to be cool characters like R2-D2 and C-3PO. But Meg? Meg was cast as the grossest, most disgusting creatures in Star Wars. She was the trash compactor monster that tries to drown Luke. She was the space slug that lives in an asteroid. She was the Sarlacc, the pit monster that slowly digests people. The message was clear. Meg wasn't even worthy of being a real character in these parodies, but nothing captured how wrong Meg's treatment had become better than Seahorse Seashell Party. This episode from Season 10 is widely considered one of the absolute worst Family Guy episodes ever made. When Meg finally stands up to her family and tells them how horrible they've been to her, it should have been a turning point. The family should have realised they were wrong. They should have changed their behaviour. They should have apologised and treated Meg better going forward. Instead, when Meg stands up for herself, the family falls apart. Without Meg to abuse, they turn on each other. Peter and Lois start fighting. Chris becomes mean. Everyone is miserable. So Meg, seeing this chaos, decides that she needs to go back to being the family punching bag to keep everyone else happy. And Brian, who's supposed to be the smart, moral character, tells her this is the right choice. He calls her a hero for letting her family abuse her. The episode was trying to make some kind of point about family dynamics and how sometimes one person absorbs negativity to keep the peace, but it came across as the show saying that abuse victims should stay in abusive situations for the benefit of their abusers. Critics absolutely destroyed this episode. The AV Club gave it a D+ and said the show spent years going down the path of least resistance by just making everyone hate Meg instead of trying to make her a good character. Viewers were even harsher. People said the episode had a genuinely dangerous moral. Some wrote online that they'd been in abusive situations, and this episode made them feel sick because it was basically telling them they should have stayed and taken the abuse. The episode has a 6.6 rating on IMDb, which is really low for Family Guy. It appears on pretty much every worst Family Guy episodes list that exists. What makes the Meg abuse even more disturbing is that the show itself seemed aware of how bad it had gotten. In several episodes, characters would acknowledge that they treat Meg terribly. They'd make jokes about how they're awful to her, but acknowledging that you're doing something wrong doesn't make it okay to keep doing it. If anything, it makes it worse, because it shows you know it's wrong and you're doing it anyway. Seth MacFarlane himself eventually got tired of the Meg hate. According to interviews and reports, MacFarlane started telling the writers to dial it back. He felt the joke had gone too far and wasn't funny anymore. Starting around season 15 and 16, there were some episodes where the family was slightly nicer to Meg. Peter would have moments where he'd defend her or say something kind. The "shut up Meg" catchphrase showed up less often, but the damage was done. Meg had spent years being treated like garbage. You can't just suddenly have the family be nice to her and expect the audience to forget everything that came before. It's like if someone punched you in the face every day for 10 years, and then one day they gave you a cookie and acted like everything was fine. Mila Kunis, the actress who voices Meg, has talked in interviews about how people yell "shut up Meg" at her on the street. She says she's a good sport about it and knows people are just showing they like the show. But imagine being an actress who's been in serious movies and TV shows, and the thing people know you for most is a character who exists to be abused and told to shut up. The Meg abuse storyline shows how Family Guy lost its way in terms of understanding what's actually funny versus what's just mean. In early seasons, the joke was that Meg was unpopular and awkward, and the audience could relate to that feeling of not fitting in. We'd root for Meg because we'd all felt like her at some point, but later seasons turned her into a punching bag, and the joke became, let's all laugh at how much this person suffers. That's not clever comedy, that's just cruelty. There's also something deeply uncomfortable about how normalised the abuse became. The show treated it as completely normal and acceptable for parents to physically and emotionally abuse their daughter. There were never any consequences. No one ever called Child Protective Services. No authority figures ever stepped in. The show existed in a universe where this level of family dysfunction was just fine. Younger viewers who discovered Family Guy in later seasons grew up thinking that the constant Meg abuse was just how the show had always been. They didn't know that early Family Guy had treated her like an actual family member. They thought the joke of the show was that everyone hates Meg, when actually, that wasn't the joke at all originally. The shift in how Meg was treated also reflected a larger problem with the show. The writers had stopped caring about the characters as people and started treating them as just vehicles for jokes. It didn't matter if the jokes made sense for the character, or if they contradicted everything we knew about them. All that mattered was getting a laugh, even if that laugh came from watching a teenage girl get emotionally destroyed by her own family, episode after episode. By the time the show realised it had gone too far with Meg, it was too late to fix it. The character had been damaged beyond repair. Even in newer seasons where they tried to be nicer to her, it felt fake because we'd seen years of genuine cruelty. You can't build trust back that easily. The Meg situation also highlights how the show had lost touch with why people liked it in the first place. Family Guy was supposed to be about a dysfunctional but ultimately loving family having crazy adventures. Instead, it became about a genuinely abusive family where nobody learned anything or grew as people. That's not fun to watch. That's just depressing. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But the loss of character growth and emotional payoff wasn't limited to just Meg's treatment. It infected every aspect of the show, turning what used to be stories with real stakes and meaning into empty sequences of random events where nothing mattered and nobody changed. Section 7. The death of character development and heart. There's an episode from Season 3 of Family Guy called Brian Wallows and Peter's Swallows. In this episode, Brian gets arrested for drunk driving and the court sentences him to community service. He's assigned to take care of an elderly shut-in woman named Pearl. Brian is annoyed at first because he thinks taking care of an old lady is going to be boring and a waste of his time. But as he spends time with Pearl, he learns that she used to be a beautiful singer who gave up her dreams decades ago because of a mean boyfriend. She's been locked in her house ever since, afraid to go outside and face the world. Brian helps Pearl gain the courage to leave her house. He encourages her to pursue her dreams again, even at her age. The episode ends with Pearl performing a song at a concert, finally living the life she should have lived years ago. And right after she finishes performing, she dies peacefully, having accomplished what she wanted before the end. Brian is devastated. He cries. The episode ends with Brian sitting alone, processing the fact that he just lost someone he cared about. It's sad, it's beautiful, it means something. That episode aired in 2002, during Season 3, before the show got cancelled the first time. It's the kind of episode that couldn't exist in Modern Family Guy. Not because Modern Family Guy couldn't do an episode about Brian helping an old woman. They could definitely do that. But Modern Family Guy wouldn't let it mean anything. There would be no emotional payoff. Brian wouldn't learn anything. The old woman probably wouldn't even stay dead. She'd show up fine in the next episode like nothing happened. Everything would be a joke and nothing would matter. That's what happened to Family Guy over the years. The show lost its ability to make you feel anything other than shock or disgust. It forgot how to tell stories that had real weight to them. Episodes stopped having beginnings, middles, and ends that connected to each other. Characters stopped growing or changing or learning from their mistakes. Everything became about getting to the next joke as fast as possible, and whether that joke made sense or connected to anything didn't matter at all. In the first few seasons of Family Guy, almost every episode ended with some kind of lesson or realization. Peter would do something stupid, things would blow up in his face, and by the end, he'd understand what he did wrong. The family would come together and have a moment. Maybe Peter would apologise to Lois. Maybe Brian would realise he was being pretentious. Maybe Chris would stand up for himself. The lessons weren't always serious or deep. Sometimes they were silly or got undercut by a joke at the last second. But they were there. The writers understood that for a show to work, characters need to go through something and come out different on the other side, even if it's just a little bit different. Even when the lessons were dumb, they gave episodes structure. You'd start with a situation, watch it develop and get complicated, and then see how it resolved. That's basic storytelling. That's how stories have worked since humans first started sitting around campfires, telling each other about their day. Something happens, it causes problems, the problems get solved or don't get solved, and we learn something from it. Modern Family Guy threw all of that out the window. Episodes started ending abruptly with no resolution. Peter would be in the middle of some crazy situation. The episode would just stop, and that was it. No lesson learned, no realization, no growth, nothing. Or worse, the episode would end with a quick, mean-spirited joke that undercut whatever story had been happening. The writers seemed to think that having an emotional or meaningful ending was corny or old-fashioned, so they avoided it completely. This killed any investment the audience had in what was happening. Why should we care about Peter's problems if nothing he does matters and he'll never change? Why should we root for any character to succeed if success doesn't mean anything and everything resets by the next episode? It's like watching someone play a video game with cheat codes on. Sure, Stuff is happening on screen, but there are no stakes and nothing matters. The structure of episodes fell apart too. Early Family Guy episodes usually had what's called an A plot and a B plot. The A plot was the main story, usually involving Peter. The B plot was a secondary story, often involving Stewie and Brian or other characters. The two plots would run alongside each other, sometimes intersecting, and they'd both reach some kind of conclusion by the end. This gave episodes depth and variety. If you weren't interested in Peter's story, you could still enjoy what Stewie and Brian were doing. Later seasons mostly abandoned B-plots. Episodes became just one story stretched across the entire runtime, padded out with extra-long cutaway gags to fill time. This made episodes feel thin and stretched out, like there wasn't enough actual content to justify 22 minutes. When B-plots did exist, they were usually pointless and went nowhere. They'd set up something with characters, follow it for a few minutes, and then just drop it without any payoff. The decline in B-plots was really noticeable with Stewie and Brian. In early seasons, their adventures together were highlights of the show. They'd go on road trips, or time travel, or get stuck in weird situations. These stories ran parallel to whatever Peter was doing, and often ended up being the best part of the episode. But later seasons either didn't give them B-plots at all, or gave them B-plots that were boring and forgettable. One fan online described the change perfectly. They said that in early Family Guy, the story was the cake and the jokes were the frosting on top of it. Now they only give viewers the icing. That captures exactly what went wrong. The jokes in early Family Guy were there to make the story funnier. The story gave the jokes context and meaning. Later Family Guy was just jokes with no substance underneath them. Just joke after joke after joke, with nothing holding them together. This also meant that character relationships stopped developing. In early seasons, you could see Peter and Lois's marriage go through different phases. They'd fight and make up. They'd support each other through tough times. Their relationship felt real, even though it was in a cartoon. Brian and Stewie's friendship deepened over time too. They started out barely tolerating each other and became best friends who'd do anything for each other. Later seasons treated relationships like they were written on an erasable whiteboard. Characters would hate each other one episode and be best friends the next, with no explanation. Peter and Lois would have huge fights that should have ended their marriage, but everything would be fine the following week. Nothing had consequences, nothing stuck. The lack of consequences became one of the show's biggest problems. Peter could commit actual crimes, assault, theft, destruction of property, and face zero punishment. He'd still have his job the next episode, even though he'd burned down the workplace. He'd still have his friends, even though he'd betrayed them. He'd still have his family, even though he'd been terrible to them. Nothing mattered, because nothing had consequences. This wasn't just lazy writing, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of how stories work. Stories need stakes. We need to feel like what happens in the story matters, that characters' choices have weight, that actions have results. When everything resets every episode like nothing happened, why should we care about anything? Early Family Guy understood consequences. In Lethal Weapons from Season 3, Lois learns martial arts and becomes really good at fighting. Peter gets jealous and challenges her, and she beats him up badly. Peter is humiliated and angry. This causes real tension in their marriage that lasts the whole episode. By the end, they work it out, but there were actual consequences to what happened. Peter's pride got hurt. Lois felt bad about hurting him, and they had to deal with those feelings. Compare that to later seasons, where Peter might literally kill someone, and the show would just move on like it didn't happen. No guilt, no police investigation, no anything, just on to the next scene. The show also stopped doing episodes where characters faced real personal challenges. Early seasons had episodes where Chris dealt with his crush on the girl at school, or where Meg tried to find her place in the world, or where Lois struggled with being a stay-at-home mum. These were relatable problems that gave us insight into the characters as people. Later seasons mostly just had characters doing random crazy stuff. Peter would become a fisherman for no reason. Brian would join a cult because why not? Stewie would build a robot duplicate of himself just because. None of it came from the characters' actual desires or problems. It was just whatever random idea the writers came up with that week. This randomness extended to character personalities too. Characters would act completely different from episode to episode, depending on what the plot needed. Peter would be smart enough to pull off a complex plan in one episode, then too dumb to tie his shoes in the next. Brian would be a voice of reason in one episode, then the biggest idiot in the room in another. There was no consistency. Even the cutaway gags, which had always been random, used to connect to what was happening in the story somehow. Peter would say something, and the cutaway would illustrate his point in a funny way. Later cutaways had zero connection to anything. A character would say a word, any word, and the show would cut to something completely unrelated. They weren't cutaways, they were just random scenes inserted into episodes for no reason. The loss of heart in the show also meant that emotional moments, when they did happen, felt fake and forced. The writers would occasionally remember that they were supposed to make the characters feel like a real family, so they'd throw in a scene where everyone hugs or says they love each other. But it rang hollow because we'd just spent the previous 20 minutes watching them be genuinely awful to each other with no remorse. You can't build up goodwill with the audience if you constantly tear it down. You can't make us care about these characters and then show them being horrible people in every episode. It doesn't work. Either commit to them being terrible and make it a dark comedy about awful people, or commit to them being a real family with real love for each other underneath the chaos. Family Guy tried to do both and ended up doing neither well. There were still occasional good episodes scattered throughout the later seasons. Episodes where the writers remembered how to tell a proper story with a beginning, middle and end. Episodes where characters had real moments together, but these became the exception rather than the rule. And even when a good episode came along, it couldn't erase all the bad episodes surrounding it. The saddest part is that Family Guy proved it could do emotional storytelling and do it well. Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows wasn't a fluke. There were other episodes like it that balanced comedy with genuine heart. Brian and Stewie, from season 8, locked the two characters in a bank vault and had them just talk to each other for 22 minutes. No cutaways, no random gags, just two characters having real conversations about their friendship, their fears, and their lives. Some fans loved it. Others hated it because it was so different from regular Family Guy. But at least it tried to be something meaningful. By season 10, these kinds of episodes had basically disappeared. Everything was jokes, shock value, and randomness. The show had trained its audience not to expect anything deeper, so when it occasionally tried to be deeper, it felt out of place and awkward. The writing staff seemed to forget that comedy works best when you care about the characters. The funniest moments in sitcom history come from watching characters we love get into ridiculous situations. We laugh because we know these people, and we want to see how they'll react. But if we don't care about the characters, if they're just cartoon figures doing random things, then the comedy has nothing to build on. Family Guy still had jokes, it still had gags, it still had pop culture references, but it lost its soul somewhere along the way. It stopped being a show about a dysfunctional family and became a show about nothing, starring characters who barely resembled the people they used to be. The loss of heart and character development showed that the people making the show had stopped caring about it as anything more than a product. They were churning out episodes to meet a quota, not because they had stories they wanted to tell. And you can feel that in every episode, this sense that nobody making the show actually cares about it anymore. But the clearest proof that the show had become a cynical money-making machine came in season 12, when the writers decided to kill off one of the main characters in what everyone immediately recognised as nothing more than a desperate grab for attention and ratings. Section 8. Life of Brian, the cynical ratings grab. On November 24th, 2013, something happened that made Family Guy fans absolutely lose their minds. An episode called Life of Brian aired, and in that episode, one of the main characters died. Not as a joke, not in a cutaway gag, not in a dream sequence. Brian Griffin, the talking dog who'd been part of the show since the very first episode in 1999, got hit by a car and died right there on screen. The family buried him. They mourned him. He was gone. The death scene itself was brutal to watch. Brian and Stewie are playing street hockey in front of the Griffin house. The ball rolls into the street and Brian goes to get it. A car comes speeding around the corner. There's not even time for Brian to react. The car hits him hard and he goes flying. The family runs outside and finds Brian lying on the pavement, bleeding and broken. He can barely talk. He tells them he loves them, and then, while the family watches, Brian dies. The animation doesn't pull away or make it silly. You watch this character, who people had known for 14 years, die slowly and painfully. The family takes Brian to the vet, but there's nothing that can be done. He's dead. They have a funeral for him. They bury him in the backyard. There's a gravestone with his name on it. Stewie cries. The whole family is devastated. This wasn't played for laughs. The episode treated Brian's death as a real, tragic thing that happened. Then, to make it even more real, the family gets a new dog. His name is Vinny, and he's completely different from Brian. He's got a New Jersey accent. He's not sophisticated or educated like Brian was. He's just a regular dog who happens to be able to talk. The message was clear. Brian wasn't coming back. This was permanent. The family had to move on with a new character. The reaction from fans was immediate and massive. People were shocked. They were angry. They were genuinely upset that Brian had been killed. Social media exploded with people talking about the episode. Did they really just kill Brian? I can't believe Brian is dead. How could they do this? The episode trended on Twitter. News sites wrote articles about it. Entertainment websites covered the fan reaction. Everyone was talking about Family Guy. But here's the thing. Most people weren't just sad. They were suspicious. Even in the moment, as the episode was airing, fans smelled something fishy about the whole situation. Brian had been part of the show for over a decade. He was one of the main characters. Seth MacFarlane voiced him. Killing him off seemed like a huge deal, but it also seemed like the kind of thing Family Guy might do just to get people talking. Online forums and message boards filled up with people predicting that Brian would come back. They're not going to keep him dead, people said. This is just a stunt. They'll bring him back before the end of the season. Some fans were more optimistic, thinking maybe the show would actually commit to this major change. Maybe Brian being gone would force the other characters to grow and change. Maybe Vinny would become a beloved new character. Maybe this was the shake-up Family Guy needed. But most people who'd been watching the show for years knew better. They knew how Family Guy operated. They knew the show didn't do permanent consequences. They knew this was probably just a trick to get people talking and boost ratings. They were absolutely right. 2 episodes later, on December 15th, 2013, an episode called Christmas Guy aired. In this episode, Stewie finds his time machine, which had been destroyed in an earlier episode but was apparently fixable. He uses it to travel back in time to the moment before Brian got hit by the car. He pushes Brian out of the way and Brian lives. Everything goes back to normal. Brian is alive again. Vinny disappears from the show and is never mentioned again. It was like the previous 2 episodes never happened. The whole thing had lasted less than a month. From Brian's death on November 24th to his resurrection on December 15th was only 3 weeks. 3 weeks. That's how long the show made fans believe that Brian was actually dead. The fan reaction to Brian coming back was even bigger than the reaction to him dying. But this time, instead of being sad or upset, people were angry. They felt manipulated. They felt like the show had played with their emotions just to get attention. And they were right. That's exactly what had happened. Critics and entertainment websites immediately called out the show for what everyone now recognised as an obvious ratings stunt. The death and resurrection of Brian was designed to do one thing: get people talking about Family Guy. And it worked. For 3 weeks, Family Guy was all over the news and social media. People who hadn't watched the show in years tuned in to see what happened. Ratings went up. Mission accomplished. But the cost was enormous. Fans felt betrayed. The show had asked them to care about something serious, the death of a beloved character, and then revealed that it was all fake and meaningless. It was like the writers were laughing at fans for actually caring about the show. Haha, you thought we'd actually make a real change? You thought this meant something? Joke's on you. The manipulation was made worse by how the show handled it in interviews. After Brian came back, Seth MacFarlane and other people involved with the show acted like the whole thing had been a lesson about appreciating characters while you have them. MacFarlane said something about how the point was to show that losing someone important makes you realise how much they meant to you. But that excuse fell flat. You don't need to fake kill a character to teach that lesson. You don't need to manipulate your audience's emotions for 3 weeks to make them appreciate your show. The truth was obvious to everyone. Family Guy's ratings had been declining, and the show needed a boost. Killing Brian was a desperate attempt to get people talking and watching again. When it worked, when the ratings went up and people paid attention, the show brought him back and pretended it had all been planned from the start as some kind of meaningful story. What made the whole thing even more cynical was that Brian came back exactly the same as he was before. He didn't change. He didn't learn anything from dying and coming back to life. The experience didn't affect him at all. He was still the same preachy, pretentious character he'd been before his death. The resurrection had 0 consequences and 0 meaning. It was purely a reset button that put everything back the way it was. The other characters didn't change either. Stewie saved Brian, but their friendship didn't deepen or become different because of it. Peter and the rest of the family were happy Brian was back, but they treated him the same way they always had. Nothing mattered. Nothing meant anything. It was all just a stunt. Even Vinny, the replacement dog, got thrown away like garbage. He appeared in 2 episodes and then disappeared forever once Brian came back. The show didn't even bother explaining where he went. Did he go back to his old life? Did the Griffins kick him out? Did he just vanish into thin air? Who knows? The show didn't care enough to tell us. Vinny wasn't a character, he was a placeholder, a temporary prop to make Brian's absence feel real. Some fans actually liked Vinny during his brief time on the show. He was different from Brian in interesting ways. He was working class and street smart instead of educated and sophisticated. He had a completely different energy. A few people thought Vinny could have been a good permanent addition to the show, bringing a fresh dynamic to the family. But nope, as soon as Brian came back, Vinny ceased to exist. The Life of Brian stunt destroyed whatever remaining trust fans had in the show. People realised that Family Guy would do absolutely anything for ratings and attention, no matter how manipulative or cynical. The show wasn't interested in telling good stories or developing characters. It was interested in making headlines and tricking people into watching. This wasn't the first time a TV show had killed off a character and brought them back. It happens sometimes in shows, especially fantasy or science fiction shows, where magic or time travel exist. But usually when it happens, there's a good reason for it. The death teaches the character something. The resurrection has meaning. There's a purpose to the whole thing beyond just getting people to tune in. Family Guy's version had no purpose except marketing. It was the TV equivalent of clickbait. You won't believe what happens to Brian. This character dies in tonight's episode. It was designed to generate buzz, and nothing more. The incident also showed how far the show had fallen from its roots. Early Family Guy would never have done something like this. Early Family Guy cared too much about its characters to use them as pawns in a ratings game. Early Family Guy understood that for comedy to work, you need the audience to care about the people involved. Pulling a stunt like fake killing Brian and bringing him back 3 weeks later teaches the audience not to care. It teaches them that nothing on the show matters and they shouldn't invest emotionally in anything. After Brian came back, some fans just stopped watching altogether. They'd been hanging on, hoping the show would improve, and the fake death was the last straw. They realised the show they'd loved was gone and wasn't coming back. Other fans kept watching, but with a new understanding. Don't take anything seriously, don't expect anything to matter, and don't be surprised when the show does something purely for shock value. The whole Brian death and resurrection incident has become one of the most infamous moments in Family Guy history. It's brought up constantly in discussions about when the show jumped the shark, a term that means when a show does something so desperate or ridiculous that it's clear the quality is gone forever. Many fans point to Life of Brian as the exact moment they knew Family Guy was beyond saving. What's particularly sad is that if the show had actually committed to killing Brian permanently, it could have been interesting. Losing a main character forces change. It forces other characters to step up and fill the void. It creates opportunities for new dynamics and relationships. Vinny could have become a great character if they'd given him time to develop. The show could have explored how the family dealt with loss and grief in a meaningful way. But Family Guy didn't have the courage to actually make a big change. They wanted the attention and ratings boost that came from killing Brian, but they didn't want to deal with the actual consequences of losing a main character. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too. Get credit for doing something bold while actually doing nothing at all. The fake death also highlighted something people had suspected for years. The writers didn't really know what to do with Brian anymore. They turned him into such an unlikable character that killing him off probably seemed like a good idea at first. But then they realised they needed him for certain types of episodes and jokes, so they brought him back. Brian existed in this weird space where the show didn't know how to fix him, but couldn't get rid of him either. In the end, Life of Brian accomplished one thing. It proved that modern Family Guy was willing to sacrifice anything, character development, emotional honesty, audience trust, for short-term attention and ratings. It was cynical, manipulative, and insulting to fans who'd supported the show for years. The incident stands as maybe the clearest example of everything wrong with later Family Guy. No heart, no meaning, no consequences, just cheap tricks and manipulation designed to make people watch. even if it meant making them feel stupid for caring in the first place. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But Brian's fake death was just one episode, one moment of shameless manipulation. There were entire episodes throughout the show's run that were so bad, so uncomfortable, so poorly thought out, that they achieved legendary status as the absolute worst Family Guy had to offer. And those episodes revealed even deeper problems with what the show had become. Section 9. The worst episodes in Family Guy history. Every long-running TV show has bad episodes. That's just part of making television. When you're producing 20 or more episodes a year for over 2 decades, some of them are going to miss the mark. Some episodes will be boring. Some will have jokes that don't land. Some will have weak plots. That's normal. But Family Guy didn't just have normal bad episodes. Family Guy had episodes so terrible, so uncomfortable, so fundamentally broken that they became legendary for all the wrong reasons. These weren't just episodes that failed to be funny. They were episodes that made people genuinely angry or upset. The worst part is that these terrible episodes weren't scattered randomly across the show's run. They clustered together in specific seasons, particularly seasons 10, 12, and 13. It was like the writers hit a wall and just kept crashing into it over and over, producing some of the most hated television episodes in recent memory. Let's start with what many people consider the absolute worst. Seahorse Seashell Party from season 10. This episode aired on October 2nd, 2011, and it made fans so angry that people still bring it up years later as an example of everything wrong with modern Family Guy. The setup seemed promising enough. A hurricane is coming to Quahog, and the Griffin family is stuck inside their house with no TV and nothing to do. Being trapped together forces them to actually interact with each other instead of staring at screens. The episode had 2 main stories happening at the same time. In one, Brian eats magic mushrooms and has a bad drug trip. In the other, the family starts picking on Meg like they always do, but this time she finally fights back. The Brian story was just weird and disturbing. After eating the mushrooms, Brian starts hallucinating. The animation shows these hallucinations in detail. Brian seeing scary, surreal things that don't make sense. At one point, he sees Peter burning to death. In another scene, Brian cuts off his own ear because he thinks it's something else. Stewie has to take care of Brian and keep him from hurting himself worse. The whole thing went on for a long time and had basically no jokes. It was just uncomfortable to watch. But the Brian story wasn't why people hated this episode. The real problem was the Meg story. After years and years of being the family's punching bag, Meg finally snaps. She goes off on every member of her family, telling them exactly how terrible they are. She calls out Peter for being a horrible father. She calls out Lois for being fake and self-centered. She tears into Chris for being mean to her. She holds nothing back, and for a moment, it's actually satisfying to watch. Finally, Meg is standing up for herself. Finally, someone is calling the Griffins out for how they treat her. But then the episode takes a turn that made people furious. After Meg stands up to her family, they start turning on each other. Without Meg to abuse, they start fighting with each other instead. They can't function as a family when they don't have someone to put down. Seeing this chaos, Meg decides that she needs to go back to being the family punching bag. She apologizes to them and says she'll accept their abuse because it keeps the family together. And Brian, who's supposed to be the smart, moral character, tells Meg that she's a hero for doing this. He actually calls her heroic for letting her family abuse her. The message of the episode was crystal clear. If you're in an abusive situation, you should stay in it for the benefit of your abusers. Don't rock the boat. Don't stand up for yourself. Just take the abuse so everyone else can be happy. That's what the episode was literally saying. Critics destroyed this episode. The AV Club, a respected entertainment website, gave it a D+. Their reviewer wrote that the show had spent years making Meg a punching bag instead of trying to make her a good character, and one episode wasn't going to fix that. Another critic from Ology said the episode was an episode that spends a lot of time addressing something that didn't need to be addressed. Regular viewers were even harsher. On IMDb, the episode has a rating of 6.6 out of 10, which is really low for Family Guy. People wrote reviews saying the episode had a dangerous moral that could actually hurt people in real life. Some viewers shared stories about being in abusive situations themselves and how this episode made them feel sick because it was basically telling them they should have stayed and taken the abuse for the good of their abusers. One reviewer on IMDb wrote that they'd been abused by their brother as a child and finally stood up for themselves, just like Meg did in the episode. But unlike Meg, this person's life got better after standing up to their abuser. They became best friends with their brother after the brother learned he couldn't treat them that way anymore. This reviewer was furious that Family Guy was telling a completely opposite story, that standing up to abuse makes things worse and you should just accept it. The episode appeared on pretty much every worst Family Guy episodes list on the internet. Entertainment websites, YouTube channels, blogs, everyone agreed this was one of the absolute worst. It wasn't just unfunny, it had a genuinely harmful message. But wait, it gets worse. The very next episode that aired after Seahorse Seashell Party was called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q. This episode aired on October 9th, 2011, just 1 week later. In this episode, Glenn Quagmire's sister Brenda shows up, and we quickly learn that her boyfriend Jeff is physically abusing her. Jeff hits her in front of everyone. He's cruel and violent. The episode tries to treat domestic abuse as a serious subject. The problem is that you can't have one episode saying abuse victims should stay in abusive relationships, and then the very next week have an episode that treats abuse as a serious problem that needs to be stopped. The show contradicted itself within the span of 7 days, and beyond that contradiction, the whole episode was deeply hypocritical. Family Guy had spent years showing women being beaten, harassed and abused for laughs. The show constantly made jokes about domestic violence. Peter physically hurt Lois all the time, and it was played as comedy. Now suddenly the show was trying to tell a serious story about how domestic violence is bad? People weren't buying it. You can't spend years treating something as a joke and then suddenly act like you care about it. Critics pointed out that the episode felt cheap and hypocritical. Fans noted that the Griffin family themselves was abusive. Peter abused Meg constantly, and nobody seemed to care about that. How was Peter supposed to be the hero helping someone escape an abusive relationship when he was abusive himself? The episode ended with Quagmire killing Jeff to save Brenda from the abuse, so at least this episode didn't have the same terrible moral as Seahorse Seashell Party. But it still felt wrong coming from a show that had made domestic violence a recurring source of comedy. Then there's Fresh Air from season 12, which many critics called the single worst Family Guy episode ever made. This episode aired on April 13th, 2014. The plot is absolutely insane and uncomfortable. Lois's father, the rich guy named Carter Pewterschmidt, decides to leave his fortune to Chris instead of Peter when he dies. Peter gets incredibly jealous and angry. His solution? He decides he's going to marry Chris, so that when Carter dies, Peter will get the inheritance as Chris's spouse. Yes, you read that right. Peter tries to marry his own son. The episode is about incest. Peter actively pursues marrying Chris throughout the episode. He tries to romance his own child. The whole thing is deeply disturbing and not funny at all. Even for a show that pushed boundaries and made shocking jokes, this was too far. One critic wrote that Family Guy had become the new Alan Gregory, referring to a terrible animated show that also made jokes about inappropriate relationships. Another critic said this episode proved the show had completely run out of ideas and was just trying to shock people for attention. The episode had long, awkward pauses after jokes that didn't work. The pacing was terrible. The premise was revolting. And worst of all, none of it was funny. It was just uncomfortable and gross from start to finish. But even Fresh Air wasn't alone in being horrifically bad. There was Stewie is Enceinte from season 13, which had a plot about Stewie getting pregnant with Brian's baby. The episode showed Stewie carrying a baby that was somehow biologically his and Brian's. One critic wrote that everyone involved in making this episode should go to jail. They called it repulsive and said it only got grosser and weirder as it went on. There was Brian's a Bad Father, which focused on Brian neglecting his son Dylan. The episode was mean-spirited and made Brian look terrible without any redeeming qualities. There were multiple episodes that tried to do serious stories about cancer, death, or other heavy topics, but failed because Family Guy had lost the ability to balance comedy with genuine emotion. The show couldn't do serious anymore because it had spent so long being nothing but jokes and shock value. What all these terrible episodes had in common was that they showed a complete disconnect between the writers and the audience. The writers seemed to think that being shocking or controversial was the same as being funny or interesting. They thought that if they pushed boundaries far enough, people would have to pay attention. But there's a difference between pushing boundaries in clever ways and just being gross or offensive for no reason. These episodes also revealed how the writers had stopped caring about the characters as people. They were willing to put the characters in any situation, no matter how disturbing or out of character, if they thought it might get a reaction. Peter trying to marry his son? Sure, why not? Stewie pregnant with Brian's baby? Go for it. Meg being told to accept abuse? Sounds good. Nothing was off limits, not because the show was brave or edgy, but because the writers had no standards left. The worst episodes of Family Guy weren't just bad, they were harmful. Seahorse Seashell Party had a message that could genuinely hurt people in abusive situations. Fresh Air normalized incest as comedy. Screams of Silence trivialized domestic violence while pretending to take it seriously. These episodes did real damage to the show's reputation and made people question whether Family Guy deserved to stay on the air. Fans who'd stuck with the show through the declining quality often pointed to these episodes as the moments they finally gave up. You can tolerate a show getting less funny, you can tolerate characters changing, but it's harder to tolerate episodes that make you genuinely uncomfortable or angry. Episodes that seem designed to upset you rather than entertain you. The existence of these episodes proved that modern Family Guy had lost its way completely. The show wasn't trying to be good anymore. It was trying to be controversial and shocking, mistaking outrage for engagement. As long as people were talking about Family Guy, even if they were talking about how terrible it was, the show considered that a win. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But terrible individual episodes were just symptoms of larger problems with how the show was being made, problems that affected every aspect of production and revealed just how much the quality had collapsed across the board. Section 10. Running gags lost all meaning. Back in May 2000, during Season 2 of Family Guy, an episode called Road to Rhode Island aired. This was the first of what would become known as the Road to episodes. In this episode, Brian and Stewie end up stranded in Texas after a trip goes wrong, and they have to find their way back home to Rhode Island. The episode was different from regular Family Guy episodes in a bunch of ways. It had elaborate musical numbers, actual full songs with choreography and everything. It had Brian and Stewie bonding as they went through adventures together. It parodied the old Road to movies from the 1940s and 1950s, starring Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, which were about two guys going on crazy adventures in exotic locations. Fans loved it. The Road to episodes became some of the most popular and beloved episodes in the entire series. They gave Brian and Stewie a chance to have their own adventures separate from the rest of the family. The episodes were usually more ambitious than regular episodes, with better animation, catchier songs, and more interesting plots. Over the years, they made Road to episodes, set in different dimensions, different time periods, and different parts of the world. Road to the Multiverse from Season 8 in 2009 was particularly amazing. In that episode, Stewie invents a remote control that lets him and Brian travel to parallel universes. They visit a universe where dogs are the smart ones and humans are the pets. They visit a Disney universe where everything is animated like a classic Disney cartoon. They visit a universe where everyone is drawn in the style of old political cartoons. The episode was creative, funny, and showed what Family Guy could do when the writers really tried. It's often listed as one of the best episodes of the entire series, but then the Road to episodes just stopped. The last one was Road to India in 2016, during Season 14, and even that one wasn't very good. Critics said it had too obvious jokes about bindis and call centres, and felt tired and stale compared to the earlier Road to episodes. The episode felt like the writers were just going through the motions, hitting all the expected beats without any real creativity or effort. After 2016, there were no more Road to episodes. None. The show just abandoned one of its most popular and successful running gags. Why? The most likely reason is that these episodes took more work to make than regular episodes. They required original songs, which meant hiring composers and lyricists. They required more elaborate animation for the musical numbers and exotic locations. They required the writers to actually plan out a coherent story that would work across the entire episode. In short, they took effort, and modern Family Guy seemed allergic to effort. The disappearance of the Road to episode symbolised a bigger problem. The show was abandoning everything that had made it special and unique. Instead of doing ambitious episodes that stood out, the show was settling for the easiest, cheapest option every single time. Another running gag that got run into the ground was the chicken fight. The first chicken fight happened way back in Season 2. in an episode called Da Boom. Peter gets in a fight with a giant chicken named Ernie over an expired coupon. What follows is an incredibly over-the-top fight scene that destroys half the town. The fight is way longer than it needs to be, and that's part of what makes it funny. It's ridiculous and excessive and completely unexpected. The chicken fights became a recurring thing throughout the series. Every once in a while, Peter would run into the chicken again, and they'd have another massive fight that would destroy everything around them. These fights got more and more elaborate. They'd fight through different time periods. They'd fight in space. They'd cause millions of dollars in property damage. The fights were well choreographed and actually impressive from an animation standpoint. But here's the thing about a joke that relies on being excessive and unexpected. It stops working when people expect it. The first chicken fight was funny because nobody saw it coming. The second one was still funny because it had been a while, and the fight was even bigger. But by the fifth or sixth chicken fight, the joke had worn thin. People knew what was coming. The fights weren't surprising anymore. They were just long action sequences that stopped the episode dead in its tracks. The show also ran into a practical problem with the chicken fights. Each fight tried to be bigger and crazier than the last one, but there's only so big you can go before it stops making sense or becoming impossible to top. The writers wrote themselves into a corner, as one critic put it. They'd already done fights that destroyed entire cities. They'd already done fights across time and space. Where do you go from there? So the chicken fights became less frequent and eventually kind of petered out. When the chicken fights did happen in later seasons, they felt obligatory rather than fun. The show was doing them because fans expected them, not because the writers had anything new or interesting to do with the concept. It was like checking a box on a list. Okay, we've done our chicken fight for this season, moving on. The same thing happened with other running gags. There was a character called Herbert who was introduced in season 3. Herbert was a creepy old man who had an unsettling obsession with Chris. The character was supposed to be uncomfortable and weird, and that's what made him funny at first. But the show kept bringing Herbert back and making the jokes more and more explicit and disturbing. What started as an edgy joke about a creepy neighbour turned into something genuinely uncomfortable that wasn't funny anymore. The show had a running gag where Cleveland would be sitting in his bathtub and something would crash through his house, causing the whole bathroom section to fall off and hit the ground. As Cleveland fell, he'd slowly say, "No, no, 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 no." It was funny the first several times because of how specific and weird it was, but the show did it over and over until it became predictable and boring. There was a gag where Peter would hurt his knee and hold it while sucking air through his teeth for an uncomfortably long time. This happened in multiple episodes, going on for 30 seconds or longer. The joke was supposed to be that the moment lasted way too long, but eventually it just became annoying rather than funny. The show had a character called the Giant Chicken. That was Ernie, the chicken Peter fought. But they also had other one-note characters like Greased Up Deaf Guy, who would run around naked and greased up so nobody could catch him. These characters showed up repeatedly, doing the exact same thing every time. There was no variation, no development, no reason for them to keep appearing, except that the writers thought audiences wanted to see them again. One particularly hated running gag involved a character called Buzz Killington. Buzz was a stuffy British guy who would show up when people were having fun and start telling boring stories and facts, killing the mood. The joke was in his name. He kills the buzz. He ruins the fun. But viewers pointed out that Buzz Killington himself wasn't funny. He was just actually boring. Having a boring character on screen talking about boring things doesn't become funny just because you acknowledge it's boring. It's still boring. Some running gags just disappeared without explanation. There were the viewer mail episodes, where the show would tell 3 short stories based on ideas supposedly sent in by viewers. These anthology episodes were fun because they let the show try different settings and styles without committing to a full episode. But the show stopped doing them after 3 episodes total and never brought the concept back. The show used to have episodes that were completely cutaway free, focusing entirely on the story without any random gags. Brian and Stewie from season 8 was entirely set in one room, a bank vault, with just the 2 characters talking for the whole episode. No cutaways, no other characters, just Brian and Stewie having real conversations. Some fans loved these experimental episodes. Others hated them. But at least they showed the writers trying something different. Later seasons stopped taking these kinds of risks entirely. What happened to all these running gags shows a fundamental problem with how the show was being run. The writers didn't understand the difference between a running gag that stays fresh and one that gets stale. A good running gag evolves over time. It changes slightly each time you see it. It finds new contexts that make it funny in different ways. A bad running gag just repeats the exact same joke over and over until people are sick of it. The writers also didn't understand when to let something go. The Conway Twitty gag, which we talked about in section 4, was a perfect example. Fans hated it from the start. The show itself acknowledged that fans hated it, but they kept doing it anyway. That's not being committed to a bit. That's just being stubborn and disrespectful to your audience. The death of these running gags also meant the show lost part of its identity. When people thought about classic Family Guy, they thought about the Road To episodes, the chicken fights, the creative cutaways. These were things that made Family Guy different from other animated sitcoms. When the show abandoned these unique elements, it became more generic. It became just another animated comedy, with nothing special to make it stand out. Some defenders of the show argued that running gags have to end eventually, and it's good that the writers let them go instead of beating them completely to death. But the problem wasn't that the gags ended, it's that nothing replaced them. The show didn't create new running gags that were as good as the old ones. It didn't find new ways to be special or unique. It just became flatter and more forgettable. By the mid-2000s, Family Guy had lost most of what made it distinctive. The Road To episodes were gone. The chicken fights had become rare and predictable. The clever cutaways had been replaced by lazy ones, or just extra long clips of old footage. The characters had all been turned into worse versions of themselves. The stories had stopped mattering. Everything that had made Family Guy feel fresh and different in the early 2000s was gone. What was left was a show going through the motions, producing episodes because it had to, not because the creators had anything they wanted to say or any stories they wanted to tell. The running gags that used to give the show personality had either disappeared or become tired and stale. Family Guy had become a shell of itself, coasting on past success, while producing increasingly forgettable content. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. And here's the really sad part. At the exact same time Family Guy was losing everything that made it special, another show was proving that it didn't have to be this way. A show created by the same person, with a similar format that somehow managed to stay good while its older sibling fell apart. Section 11. American Dad surpassed Family Guy. In February 2005, just a few months before Family Guy came back from its 3-year cancellation, a new animated show premiered on Fox right after the Super Bowl. The show was called American Dad, and it was created by Seth MacFarlane, along with 2 other writers named Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. The setup was different from Family Guy, but had some similarities. Instead of a fat idiot in Rhode Island, the main character was Stan Smith, a CIA agent in Virginia who was super patriotic, conservative, and paranoid about terrorism. His family included his wife Francine, his liberal daughter Haley, his nerdy son Steve, an alien named Roger who lived in their attic, and a German-speaking goldfish named Klaus, who had the brain of an East German Olympic skier. When American Dad first started, a lot of people dismissed it as just Family Guy but with different characters. It had the same creator, it was animated in a similar style. It had a dysfunctional family with a dumb dad, talking animals, and lots of pop culture references. The first season especially felt like it was trying too hard to be Family Guy 2.0. Episodes had political jokes about George W. Bush and the War on Terror. Stan was basically Peter Griffin if Peter worked for the government and owned guns. The show even had cutaway gags just like Family Guy did, but something interesting started happening around season 3 and 4 of American Dad. The show began finding its own identity. It started doing things differently from Family Guy, and while Family Guy was getting worse and worse, American Dad was getting better and better. The 2 shows, created by the same person, airing on the same network, with similar formats, went in completely opposite directions in terms of quality. The first major difference was that American Dad mostly dropped the cutaway gags. Family Guy lived and died by cutaways, random scenes that had nothing to do with the story. American Dad used them occasionally in early seasons, but by season 4 or 5, they'd almost completely disappeared. Instead of cutting away to random jokes, American Dad committed to telling actual stories from beginning to end. The plots got weirder and more creative, but they stayed focused on the characters and what was happening to them. This made a huge difference. Without cutaways constantly interrupting everything, American Dad could build momentum and tell more complex stories. Episodes could have twists and surprises that actually mattered, instead of just being excuses to get to the next random gag. The show felt more like a real comedy with plots and character arcs, rather than just a collection of disconnected jokes. The second big difference was how American Dad treated its characters. While Family Guy was turning all its characters into extreme, unlikable versions of themselves, American Dad was actually developing its characters and making them more interesting over time. Stan started as a one-note conservative stereotype, but the show gradually revealed layers to him. He was still ridiculous and often wrong, but you could understand why he thought the way he did. He genuinely loved his family, even when he was being an idiot. Roger the Alien became the breakout character of the show. Roger had the ability to create elaborate disguises and personas, and the show used this as a way to put him in all sorts of different situations. Roger could be anyone from a psychotic wedding planner to a detective to a pretzel stand owner, and each persona felt like a fully realised character. This gave the writers an incredible amount of freedom to tell different types of stories while keeping them grounded in the characters we knew. Steve, the nerdy son, actually had friends and a life outside the family. He and his buddies went on adventures and had storylines that developed over multiple episodes. Unlike Chris on Family Guy, who became just the dumb son who makes gross jokes, Steve remained a real character with actual personality. Haley, the liberal daughter, wasn't just the family punching bag like Meg had become on Family Guy. She had her own beliefs and her own life. She got married to her boyfriend Jeff, and their relationship was actually kind of sweet in a weird way. The show respected Haley as a character, instead of just using her as a target for abuse. Even the minor characters on American Dad were better developed than Family Guy's minor characters. Haley's husband Jeff was a stoner who seemed dumb but was actually kind of wise. Principal Lewis at Steve's school was absolutely insane in the best way possible. Deputy Director Bullock at the CIA was a crazy boss character who got his own storylines. These characters felt like real parts of the show's world, not just props for jokes. The third major difference was in the type of humour. Family Guy became increasingly mean-spirited and relied on shock value, gross-out jokes, violence, offensive humour designed to make people uncomfortable. American Dad had plenty of adult humour and could definitely be edgy, but it wasn't mean for the sake of being mean. The humour came from the characters and situations, not from trying to disgust or offend the audience. American Dad also got progressively weirder in a way that worked. The show leaned into surreal, bizarre storylines that were completely crazy, but somehow made sense within the show's universe. There were episodes about Roger's multiple personalities taking over a town, episodes about Steve and his friends going on epic quests, episodes that were basically parodies of specific movies, but with the American Dad characters. The show wasn't afraid to get weird, but the weirdness served the story instead of just being random. Critics noticed the quality difference. Entertainment websites and TV reviewers who'd given up on Family Guy were praising American Dad. The AV Club, which had been brutal in reviewing later Family Guy episodes, regularly gave American Dad positive reviews. Other critics pointed out that American Dad had become the better show, despite being the younger sibling. Fans noticed too. Online forums and message boards were filled with people saying they'd stopped watching Family Guy, but still watched American Dad every week. The phrase, "American Dad is better than Family Guy," became a common opinion among people who'd grown up watching both shows. Even dedicated Family Guy fans would often admit that American Dad had surpassed it. One fan community called it an open secret among MacFarlane fans that American Dad has eclipsed its predecessor in quality and comedy. That's a fancy way of saying everyone knew American Dad was better, even if they didn't always say it out loud. American Dad had maintained its comedy much better than Family Guy and had won over some of its audience, according to people who studied television shows. The really interesting thing is that this happened even though Seth MacFarlane was less involved in American Dad than he was in Family Guy. MacFarlane co-created American Dad, but Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman were much more hands-on with the day-to-day running of the show. MacFarlane didn't voice as many characters on American Dad. He voiced Stan and Roger, but that was it. He wasn't writing as many episodes. He wasn't as creatively involved. And somehow, that made the show better. Having other creative voices in charge meant American Dad could develop its own identity, separate from MacFarlane's specific style of humour. The show could evolve and change without being tied to what MacFarlane wanted. It had the freedom to find what worked for it specifically. American Dad also benefited from not being Fox's main animated show. Family Guy was the network's cash cow, the show that brought in the most money and attention. That meant Fox executives were constantly interfering with Family Guy, making demands, pushing for specific types of episodes. American Dad flew under the radar more. It didn't have as much pressure or executive meddling, so the writers could just focus on making good episodes. In 2014, something significant happened. Fox decided not to renew American Dad for more seasons, but instead of the show being cancelled, it moved to TBS, a cable network. TBS picked up the show and kept making new episodes. This move actually helped American Dad because TBS had fewer restrictions than Fox. The show could be a little edgier and weirder without network executives worrying about advertisers or ratings as much. Meanwhile, Family Guy stayed on Fox, continuing to decline in quality, while American Dad was thriving on its new network. The two shows had completely swapped positions. In 2005, Family Guy was the beloved show making a triumphant return, and American Dad was the new show trying to prove itself. By 2015, American Dad was the show critics and fans respected, while Family Guy was the show people watched out of habit or nostalgia. The comparison between the two shows proved something important. The decline of Family Guy wasn't inevitable. It wasn't just that all shows get worse over time, or that you can't maintain quality for that many seasons. American Dad showed that you could have a similar format, a similar style of animation, even the same creator, and still produce consistently good episodes year after year. So what was the difference? Why did American Dad succeed where Family Guy failed? Several factors contributed. First, American Dad had a more focused creative vision. Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman were actively involved in running the show and maintaining quality control. Family Guy lost that focused vision when Seth MacFarlane stepped back from writing. Second, American Dad was willing to evolve and change. It dropped elements that didn't work, like the cutaways, and embraced elements that did work, like Roger's personas and the weird plots. Family Guy kept doing the same things over and over, even when they stopped working. Third, American Dad respected its characters. It developed them, gave them growth, treated them as people rather than just joke delivery systems. Family Guy turned its characters into caricatures and then into monsters. Fourth, American Dad told stories. Real stories with beginnings, middles and ends. Stories where things mattered and had consequences. Family Guy gave up on storytelling and became just a series of random events and gags. Fifth, American Dad had less pressure. It wasn't the main show. It didn't have to be everything to everyone. It could just be itself, and that freedom allowed it to thrive. The success of American Dad, while Family Guy declined, wasn't just embarrassing for Family Guy. It was proof that the problems with Family Guy were self-inflicted. The show didn't have to become what it became. It chose to prioritize shock value over substance, randomness over storytelling, and familiarity over evolution. American Dad made different choices and ended up being the better show because of it. By the 2000s, it was almost universally accepted among fans and critics that American Dad had become the superior show. People would recommend American Dad to friends while warning them to avoid later seasons of Family Guy. It had become a running joke online. If someone said they liked Seth MacFarlane's work, the response was always, "Have you watched American Dad? It's way better than Family Guy." The fact that Seth MacFarlane's second show surpassed his first show proved that talent wasn't the issue. MacFarlane was still capable of creating good television. He just wasn't putting that effort into Family Guy anymore, and the people who took over couldn't maintain what he'd built. American Dad had better showrunners, better focus, and better creative decisions, and that made all the difference. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Looking at everything Family Guy lost, the heart, the characters, the creativity, the running gags, the storytelling, and seeing American Dad maintain all of those things made the decline even more frustrating for long-time fans, because it showed that none of it had to happen this way. Section 12. The show became too self-aware. In the first few seasons of Family Guy, the show occasionally made jokes about being a TV show. Peter might look at the camera and make a comment to the audience. A character might mention they were in an episode of something. These moments were rare and felt special when they happened. They were like the show winking at you, acknowledging that yes, this is a cartoon, and we're all in on the joke together. It was fun. But somewhere along the way, Family Guy stopped occasionally winking at the audience and started constantly nudging them in the ribs while saying, "Get it? Get it?" The show became obsessed with reminding everyone that it was a TV show. Characters would talk about being on Family Guy. They'd complain about the writing. They'd reference previous episodes. They'd make jokes about Fox, the network that aired the show. They'd break what's called the fourth wall, the invisible wall between the show and the audience, so often that the wall basically didn't exist anymore. Breaking the fourth wall isn't automatically bad. Lots of great shows and movies do it. Ferris Bueller's Day Off is a classic movie where the main character talks directly to the camera. The Office is a TV show built around characters acknowledging the cameras filming them. Deadpool is a superhero movie where the hero constantly makes jokes about being in a movie. When done well, breaking the fourth wall can be clever and fun. The problem with Family Guy wasn't that it broke the fourth wall. The problem was that it broke the fourth wall constantly for no good reason, in ways that weren't funny and often as a substitute for actual jokes. The show became what critics called a meta-humor show, meaning most of the humour came from making references to itself rather than from actual comedy or storytelling. In later seasons, particularly from season 13 onward, barely an episode went by without characters acknowledging they were on a TV show. Peter would mention episode numbers, characters would talk about their voice actors, someone would reference how long the show had been on the air, Stewie would complain about the quality of recent episodes. These moments weren't building to anything or serving any purpose. They were just the writers constantly pointing out that you were watching Family Guy. One particularly annoying pattern was the show making fun of its own flaws while continuing to have those exact same flaws. Remember how we talked about God telling Peter to stop doing Conway Twitty gags in an episode called 3 Acts of God? That's a perfect example. The show acknowledged, through one of its own characters, that the Conway Twitty gag was tired and unwanted. But instead of actually stopping the gag, they just made fun of themselves for doing it and kept doing it anyway. This happened with lots of things. The show would have characters complain about how the cutaway gags were random and didn't connect to the story. Then the very next scene would be a random cutaway gag that didn't connect to the story. The show would make a joke about how they were running out of ideas. Then they'd continue making episodes that showed they were running out of ideas. It was like the writers thought that acknowledging a problem was the same as fixing it. In one episode, a teenage version of Peter starts playing a Conway Twitty song, and adult Peter immediately cuts him off and calls it annoying. The show was literally having its main character say that one of its own recurring gags was annoying, but this didn't make the gag less annoying when it showed up in other episodes. If anything, it made it more annoying, because now the show was saying, yes, we know you hate this, and we're going to keep doing it anyway. The constant self-awareness made it impossible to get invested in anything happening on the show. How can you care about Peter's problems when Peter himself keeps pointing out that he's a cartoon character on a TV show? How can you be emotionally invested in a story when the characters keep reminding you it's not real and doesn't matter? The fourth wall is there for a reason. It helps the audience suspend disbelief and treat the fictional world as real while they're watching it. When you constantly shatter that illusion, you're destroying your own show. Family Guy also started making fun of Fox, the network that aired it, way more than was funny or appropriate. Yes, in the early seasons, the show would occasionally make a joke about Fox cancelling shows or making bad decisions, but later seasons turned Fox bashing into a regular thing. Multiple episodes had Peter or other characters listing off failed Fox shows, making fun of Fox executives, or complaining about how the network treated them. The most extreme example came in August 2021, when Seth MacFarlane himself tweeted about wanting to move Family Guy to a different network. He said he wished the show wasn't on Fox anymore, because he disagreed with Fox News host Tucker Carlson's opinions about COVID-19 vaccines. MacFarlane wrote on Twitter, "Tucker Carlson's latest opinion piece once again makes me wish Family Guy was on any other network. Look, Fox, we both know this marriage isn't working anymore." Think about how weird that is. The creator of the show was publicly saying he didn't want his show on the network that had kept it alive for over 20 years. And this attitude bled into the show itself, with characters constantly complaining about Fox. At a certain point, it stopped being funny commentary and started feeling ungrateful and whiny. Fox had revived Family Guy when it was cancelled. Fox had kept renewing it season after season, even when ratings declined. And the show's response was to constantly bite the hand that fed it. The self-awareness also extended to making fun of the show's own declining quality. Multiple episodes in later seasons had characters talking about how Family Guy wasn't as good as it used to be. One episode from season 14 actually opened with the characters themselves addressing the drop in quality. Peter and other characters discussed how the show had gotten worse, acknowledging all the fan complaints. On the surface, this might seem like the show taking criticism seriously and being honest with its audience, but it was actually incredibly frustrating for fans because the show wasn't doing anything to fix the problems it was acknowledging. It's like if someone kept punching you in the arm, and when you complained, they said, "Yeah, I know, I'm punching you in the arm, isn't that annoying?" and then kept punching you. Acknowledging the problem doesn't help if you're not going to stop causing it. Critics pointed out that this kind of self-aware humour only works if it's occasional and smart. When every episode is filled with characters talking about being on a TV show, it becomes exhausting. One reviewer said that Family Guy had become a show where the jokes majority of the time are done with little to no subtlety. Everything was spelled out, everything was explained, nothing was left for the audience to figure out on their own. The show also started doing entire episodes that were just references to other things. There were multiple Star Wars parody episodes where Family Guy characters acted out the plots of Star Wars movies. There were episodes parodying specific films or TV shows beat by beat. These weren't really Family Guy episodes. They were just the show playing dress-up with other people's stories. Now, parody can be great. The Star Wars episodes in particular had some genuinely funny moments. But when a show relies too heavily on parodying other things, it suggests the writers can't come up with their own original ideas anymore. It's easier to just retell Star Wars with your characters than to write an actual new story. The meta-humor got so bad that fans started complaining about it specifically. Online forums had threads about how the constant fourth wall breaking was ruining the show. People said they couldn't watch episodes anymore because the characters wouldn't shut up about being on Family Guy. The self-awareness that had once been a fun, occasional joke had become the entire personality of the show. Another problem with all the meta-humor was that it felt smug. The show seemed to think it was clever for pointing out its own flaws and making fun of itself, but there's nothing clever about saying, "Hey, we're bad now, isn't that funny?" and then continuing to be bad. If you know you're making a bad show, make a better show. Don't just make jokes about making a bad show. The constant self-reference also made Family Guy feel insular and closed off. New viewers who hadn't watched every previous episode were lost when characters referenced things from season 6 or made inside jokes about the show's history. The show was no longer trying to be funny for a general audience. It was making jokes for people who'd watched every episode and followed all the behind-the-scenes drama. By the late 2000s and early 2000s, the meta-humor had completely taken over. You couldn't get through an episode without multiple reminders that you were watching a TV show. Characters would complain about their storylines. They'd reference their voice actors by name. They'd talk about what season and episode number it was. They'd make jokes about streaming services and how people watch the show. The tragedy of all this self-awareness is that it showed the writers knew exactly what was wrong with the show. They knew the cutaways were lazy. They knew the characters had become unlikable. They knew the plots were weak. They knew people thought the show had declined. They knew all of this, and instead of fixing any of it, they just made jokes about it. It's like the writers gave up on actually making Family Guy good again, and instead decided to just acknowledge that it was bad while keeping it bad. That's not comedy, that's cynicism. It's the creative equivalent of shrugging and saying, "What are you going to do?" while continuing to produce subpar content. The show's excessive self-awareness proved that modern Family Guy had become something sad. A show that was aware enough to know it had problems, but too lazy or too burned out to actually solve them. It was easier to make fun of yourself for being bad than to put in the work to be good again. This transformation from a show that occasionally winked at the audience to a show that constantly commented on its own existence was just one more way Family Guy lost what made it special in the first place. The confidence and creativity of early seasons have been replaced with self-consciousness and excuse-making. The show that used to tell stories was now just talking about itself, and nobody wanted to listen anymore. But after examining everything that went wrong, from Seth MacFarlane stepping away, to characters being destroyed, to lazy writing, to cynical stunts, to constant self-reference, one question remains. What can we learn from Family Guy's decline? And is there any hope for the show's future? Conclusion. Family Guy's decline from beloved animated comedy to widely criticised shell of its former self didn't happen overnight. It was a slow collapse that happened piece by piece over more than a decade. The 2005 revival brought the show back to life, but it also marked the beginning of the end. When Seth MacFarlane stopped writing scripts in 2010, the show lost its creative compass. Without him actively steering the ship, the writers turned Peter Griffin from a lovable idiot into a genuine monster, transformed Brian from the voice of reason into an insufferable know-it-all, and made Meg's abuse so extreme it stopped being funny and started being disturbing. The laziness showed everywhere. Conway Twitty performances filled airtime without requiring any actual creative work. Episodes stopped having real endings or lessons. Characters no longer grew or changed. The Road 2 episodes and other beloved traditions disappeared. When the show killed Brian only to bring him back 3 weeks later, it proved the writers would do anything for ratings, no matter how cynical or manipulative. The saddest part is that it didn't have to be this way. American Dad, created by the same person with a similar format, proved you could maintain quality over many seasons. The difference was that American Dad had focused leadership, respected its characters, and told actual stories. Family Guy lost all of those things. By constantly making fun of its own decline while doing nothing to fix it, modern Family Guy became a show that had given up on itself. The writers knew what was wrong, but chose to acknowledge the problems rather than solve them. What started as groundbreaking comedy in 1999 had become, by the 2020s, a cautionary tale about what happens when a show values shock and laziness over substance and heart. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.